Chapter 30 of Self-Control, a Novel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Self-Control, a Novel by Mary Brunton. Chapter 30. As Lady Pelham's carriage passed the entrance of the avenue which led to Norwood, Laura sunk into a profound reverie, in the course of which she settled most minutely the behaviour proper for her first meeting with De Courcy. She decided on the gesture of unembarrassed cordiality with which she was to accost him, intending her manner to intimate that she accounted him a friend, and only a friend. The awkwardness of a private interview she meant to avoid by going to Norwood next day, at an hour which she knew that Montague employed in reading aloud to his mother. All this excellent arrangement, however, was unfortunately useless. Laura was taking a very early ramble in what had always been her favourite walk, when, at a sudden turn, she saw De Courcy not 3 steps distant. Her white gown shining through the still leafless trees had caught his attention. The slightest glimpse of her form was sufficient for the eye of love, and he had advanced prepared to meet her, while she, thus taken by surprise, stood before him conscious and blushing. At this confusion, so flattering to a lover, De Courcy's heart gave one bound of triumphant joy, but he was too modest to ascribe to love what timidity might so well account for, and he prudently avoided reminding Laura, even by a look, of either his hopes or his wishes. Quickly recollecting herself, Laura entered into a conversation which, though at first reserved and interrupted, returned by degrees to the confidential manner which De Courcy had formerly won from her under the character of her father's friend. This confidence, so precious to him, De Courcy was careful never to interrupt. From the time of Laura's return he saw her almost daily. She made long visits to Mrs. De Courcy. He came often to Walburn. They met in their walks, in their visits. They spent a week together under Mr. Bolingbroke's roof, yet De Courcy religiously kept his promise, nor ever wilfully reminded Laura that he had a wish beyond her friendship. Always gentle, respectful, and attentive, he never invited observation by distinguishing her above others who had equal claims on his politeness. She only shared his assiduities with every other woman whom he approached, nor did he betray uneasiness when she, in her turn, received attentions from others. His prudent self-command had the effect which he intended, and Laura, in conversing with him, felt none of the reserve which may be supposed to attend intercourse with a rejected admirer. His caution even at times deceived her. She recollected Mrs. Douglas's prophecy that his attachment would soon subside into friendly regard, and imagined she saw its accomplishment. "How happy are men in having such flexible affections," thought she with a sigh. "I wonder whether he has entirely conquered the passion which, 3 short months ago, was to last through life, beyond life. I hope he has," whispered she with a deeper sigh, and she repeated it again, "I hope he has," as if by repeating it she would have ascertained that it was her real sentiment. Yet, at other times, some little inadvertency, unheeded by less interested observers, would awaken a doubt of De Courcy's self-conquest, and in that doubt Laura unconsciously found pleasure. She often reconsidered the arguments which her friend had used to prove that passion is unnecessary to the happiness of wedded life. She did not allow that she was convinced by them, but she half wished that she had had an opportunity of weighing them before she had decided her fate with regard to De Courcy. Meanwhile, much of her time was spent in his company, and his presence had ever brought pleasure with it. Week after week passed agreeably away, and the close of the winter atoned for the disquiet which had marked its commencement. During all this time, Laura saw nothing of Hargrave. His visits, indeed, to Walburn were more frequent than she supposed, but the only one of which she had been informed, Lady Pelham affected to announce to her, advising her to avoid it by spending that day at Norwood. Since their return from town, her ladyship had entirely desisted from her remonstrances in his favour, and Laura hoped that his last outrage had opened her aunt's eyes to the deformity of his character. And, Could Lady Pelham's end have been pursued without annoyance to any living being, it would long before have shared the perishable nature of her other purposes. But whatever conferred the invaluable occasion of tormenting was cherished by Lady Pelham as the dearest of her concerns, and she only waited fit opportunity to show that she could be as stubborn in thwarting the wishes of others as capricious in varying her own. De Courcy's attachment could not escape her penetration, and as she was far from intending to desert the cause of Hargrave, she saw, with displeasure, the progressive advancement of Laura's regard for the friend of her father. Though she was sufficiently acquainted with Laura to know that chiding would effect no change in her sentiments or conduct, she had no temper enough to restrain her upbraidings on this subject, but varied them with all the skill and perseverance of a veteran in provocation. She did not, she must confess, understand the delicacy of ladies whose affections could be transferred from one man to another. She did not see how any modest woman could find two endurable men in the world. It was a farce to tell her of friendship and gratitude and such like stuff. Everybody knew the meaning of a friendship between a girl of 19 and a good-looking young fellow of 25. She wondered whether Laura was really wise enough to imagine that De Courcy could afford to marry her, or whether, if he were mad enough to think of such a thing, she could be so ungenerous as to take advantage of his folly, to plunge him into irretrievable poverty, and this, too, when it was well known that a certain young heiress had prior claims upon him. Laura at first listened to these harangues with tolerable sang-froid, yet they became, she was unconscious why, every day more provoking. Though she had self-command enough to be silent, her changing colour announced Lady Pelham's victory, and it was followed up without mercy or respite. It had, however, no other effect than that of imposing a restraint when her ladyship happened to be present, for De Courcy continued his attentions, and Laura received him with increasing favour. Lady Pelham omitted none of the minor occasions of distributing this harmonious intercourse. She interrupted their tete-a-tetes, beset them in their walks, watched their most insignificant looks, pried into their most commonplace messages, and dexterously hinted to the one whatever foible she could see or imagine in the other. A casual breath of scandal soon furnished her with a golden opportunity of sowing dissension, and she lost no time in taking advantage of the hint. "It is treating me like a baby," she once said to Laura, after opening in form her daily attack. "It is treating me like a mere simpleton to expect that you are to deceive me with your flourishing sentiments about esteem and gratitude. Have esteem and gratitude the blindness of love? Don't I see that you overlook in your beloved Montague de Courcy faults which in another you would think sufficient excuse for any ill treatment that you choose to inflict?" Laura kept silence, for of late she had found that her temper could not stand a charge of this kind. "Whatever becomes of your fine high-flown notions of purity and so forth," continued Lady Pelham, "when you excuse his indiscretions with his mother's protégé, and make a favourite and a plaything of his spoilt bantling?" Laura turned pale, then reddened violently. "What protégé? What bantling?" cried she, quite thrown off her guard. "I know of no indiscretions. I have no playthings." "What? You pretend not to know that the brat he takes so much notice of is his own? Did you never hear of his affair with a pretty girl whom his mamma was training as a waiting-maid for her fine lady daughter?" "Mr. De Courcy, madam!" cried Laura, making a powerful struggle with her indignation. "He seduce a girl who as a member of his family was doubly entitled to his protection? Is it possible that your ladyship can give credit to such a calumny?" "Heyday!" cried Lady Pelham, with a provoking laugh. "A most incredible occurrence, to be sure. And pray, why should your immaculate Mr. De Courcy be impeccable any more than other people?" "I do not imagine, madam," returned Laura, with recovered self-possession, "that Mr. De Courcy, or any of the human race, is perfectly sinless, but nothing short of proof shall convince me that he is capable of deliberate wickedness, or even that the casual transgressions of such a man can be so black in their nature, so heinous in their degree. It were next to a miracle if one who makes conscience of guarding his very thoughts could, with a single step, make such progress in iniquity." "It were a miracle indeed," said Lady Pelham sneeringly, "if you could be prevailed upon to believe anything that contradicts your romantic vagaries. As soon as you are determined to worship Mr. De Courcy, You'll never listen to anything that brings him down from his pedestal." "It is wasting time," returned Laura calmly, "to argue on the improbability of this malicious tale. I can easily give your ladyship the pleasure of being able to contradict it. Mrs. Bolingbroke is at Norwood. She will tell me frankly who is the real father of little Henry, and I shall feel no difficulty in asking her. Will you have the goodness to send me the carriage for an hour?" "A pretty expedition, truly," cried Lady Pelham, "and mighty delicate and dignified it is for a young lady to run about inquiring into the pedigree of all the bastards in the county. I assure you, Miss Montraville, that I shall neither countenance nor assist such a scheme." "Then, madam," answered Laura coolly, "I shall walk to Norwood. The claims of dignity, or even of delicacy, are surely inferior to those of justice and gratitude. But though it should subject me to the scorn of all mankind, I will do what in me lies to clear his good name, whose kindness ministered the last comforts that sweetened the life of my father." The manner in which these words were pronounced showed Lady Pelham that resistance was useless. She was far from wishing to quarrel with the De Courcy family, and she now began to fear that she should appear the propagator of the scandal. Having little time to consult the means of safety, since Laura was already leaving the room, she hastily said, "I suppose in your explanations with Mrs. Bolingbroke you will give me up for your authority?" "No, madam," replied Laura, with a scorn which she could not wholly suppress. "Your ladyship has no right to think so at the moment when I am showing such concern for the reputation of my friends." Lady Pelham would have fired at this disdain, but her quietus was at hand. She was afraid of provoking Laura to expose her, and therefore she found it perfectly possible to keep her temper. "If you are resolved to go," said she, "you had better wait till I order the carriage. I fear we shall have rain." Laura at first refused, but Lady Pelham pressed her, with so many kind concerns for a slight cold which she had, that though she saw through the veil, she suffered her ladyship to wear it undisturbed. The carriage was ordered, and Laura hastened to Norwood. Though she entertained not the slightest doubt of De Courcy's integrity, she was restless and anxious. It was easy to see that her mind was preoccupied during the few minutes which passed before, taking leave of Mrs. De Courcy, she begged Mrs. Bolingbroke to speak with her apart. Harriet followed her into another room, and Laura, with much more embarrassment than she had expected to feel, prepared to begin her interrogation. Harriet, from the thoughtful aspect of her companion, anticipating something of importance, stood gravely waiting to hear what she had to say, while Laura was confused by the awkwardness of explaining her reason for the question she was about to ask. "I have managed this matter very ill," said she at last, pursuing her thoughts aloud. "I have entered into it with so much formality that you must expect some very serious affair, and, after all, I am only going to ask a trifling question. Will you tell me who is the father of my pretty little Henry?" Harriet looked surprised, and answered, "Really, my dear, I am not sure that I dare. You inquired the same thing once before, and just when I was going to tell you, Montague looked so terrible that I was forced to hold my tongue. But what makes you ask? What, you won't tell? Then I know how it is. My prophecy has proved true, and the good folks have given him to Montague himself. Ah, what a tell-tale face you have, Laura! And who has told you this pretty story?" "It is of no consequence," replied Laura, "that you should know my authority, provided that I have yours to contradict the slander." "You shall have better authority than mine," returned Harriet. "Those who were malicious enough to invent such a tale of Montague might well assert that his sister employed falsehood to clear him. You shall hear the whole from Nurse Margaret herself, and her evidence cannot be doubted. Come, will you walk to the cottage and hear what she has to say?" They found Margaret alone, and Harriet, impatient till her brother should be fully justified, scarcely gave herself time to answer the old woman's civilities before she entered on her errand. "Come, nurse," said she, with all her natural frankness of manner, "I have something particular to say to you. Let's shut the door and sit down. Do you know somebody has been malicious enough to tell Miss Montraville that Montague is little Henry's father?" Margaret lifted up her hands and eyes. "My young master, madam!" cried she. "He go to bring shame and sorrow into any honest man's family. If you'll believe me, miss," continued she, turning to Laura, "this is, begging your pardon, the wickedest lie that was ever told." Laura was about to assure her that she gave no credit to the calumny, but Harriet, who had a double reason for wishing that her friend should listen to Margaret's tale, interrupted her, saying, "Nurse, I am sure nothing could convince her so fully as hearing the whole story from your own lips. I brought her hither on purpose, and you may trust her, I assure you, for she is just such a wise, prudent creature as you always told me that I ought to be." "Oh, madam," answered Margaret, "I know that, for John says she is the prettiest behaved young lady he ever saw, and says how fond my lady is of her, and others too besides my lady, though it is not for servants to be making remarks." "Come then, nurse," said Harriet, "sit down between us, and tell us the whole sad story of my poor foster sister, and clear your friend Montague from this aspersion." Margaret did as she was desired. "Oh, yes," said she, tears lending to her eyes a transient brightness, "I can talk of it now. Many a long evening John and I speak of nothing else. She always used to sit between us, but now we both sit close together. But we are growing old," continued she in a more cheerful tone, "and in a little while we shall see them all again. We had 3 of the prettiest boys. My dear young lady, you will soon have children of your own, but never set your heart upon them, nor be too proud of them, for that is only provoking Providence to take them away." "I shall probably never have so much reason," said Harriet, "as you had to be proud of your Jessie." The mother's pride had survived its object, and it brightened Margaret's faded countenance, as, pressing Harriet's hand between her own, she cried, "Ah, bless you! You were always kind to her. She was indeed the flower of my little flock, and when the boys were taken away, she was our comfort for all. But I was too proud of her. 5 years since there was not her like in all the country round. A dutiful child, too, and never made us sad or sorrowful till... and such a pretty modest creature. But I was too proud of her." Margaret stopped, and covered her face with the corner of her apron. Sympathizing tears stood in Laura's eyes, while Harriet sobbed aloud at the remembrance of the playfellow of her infancy. The old woman first recovered herself. "I shall never have done at this rate," said she, and drying her eyes, turned to address the rest of her tale to Laura. "Well, ma'am, a gentleman who used to come a-visiting to the castle, by ill fortune chanced to see her, and ever after that he noticed her and spoke to her, and flattered me up too, saying what a fine-looking young creature she was, and so well brought up, and what a pity it was that she should be destined for a tradesman's wife. So, like a fool I was, I thought no harm of his fine speeches, because Jessie always said he behaved quite modest and respectful like. But John, to be sure, was angry, and said that a tradesman was her equal, and that he hoped her rosy cheeks would never give her notions above her station. And says he, I am sure many and many a time I have thought of his words, says he, God grant I never see worse come of her than to be an honest tradesman's wife. My young master, too, saw the gentleman one day speaking to her, and he was so good to advise her himself, and told her that the gentleman meant nothing honest by all his fine speeches. And so after that she would never stop with him at all, nor give her ear to a word of his flatteries, but always ran away from him, telling him to say those fine things to his equals. So one unlucky day I had some matters to be done in the town, and Jessie said she would like to go, and poor foolish I was so left to myself that I let her go. And she dressed herself in her clean white gown. I remember it as were it but yesterday. I went to the door with her, charging her to be home early. She shook hands with me. Jessie, says I, you look just like a bride. So she smiled. No, mother, says she, I shan't leave home so merrily the day I leave it for all. And I never saw my poor child smile again. So she went, poor lamb, little thinking, and I stood in the door looking after her, thinking, like a fool as I was, that my young master need not have thought it strange, though a gentleman had taken her for a wife, for there were not many ladies looked like her." Margaret rested her arms upon her knees, bent her head over them, made a pause, and then began again. "All day I was merry as a lark, singing and making everything clean in our little habitation here, where I thought we should sit down together so happy when John came home at night from the castle. So it was getting darkish before my work was done, and then I began to wonder what was become of Jessie, and many a time I went across the green to see if there were any sight of her. At last John came home, and I told him that I was beginning to be frightened, but he laughed at me and said she had perhaps met with some of her comrades and had gone to take tea with them. So we sat down by the fire, but I could not rest, for my mind misgave me sadly. So says I, 'John, I will go and see after my girl.' 'Well,' says he, 'we may as well go and meet her.' Alas, alas! A sad meeting was that. We went to the door. I opened it, and somebody fell against me. It was Jessie. She looked as dead as she did the day I laid her in her coffin, and all her pretty cheek was blue, and her pretty mouth, that used to smile so sweetly in my face when she was a baby on my knee, it was all bloody, and her pretty shining hair that I used to comb so often. Oh, woe is me! How could I see such a sight and live?" The mother wrung her withered hands, and sobbed as if her heart were breaking. Laura laid her arms kindly round old Margaret's neck, for misfortune made the poor and the stranger her equal and her friend. She offered no words of unavailing consolation, but pitying tears trickled fast down her cheeks, while Mrs. Bolingbroke, her eyes flashing indignant fires, exclaimed, "Surely the curse of heaven will pursue that wretch." "Alas!" said Margaret, "I fear I cursed him too. But I was in a manner beside myself then. God forgive both him and me. My poor child never cursed him. All that I could say she would not tell who it was that had used her so. She said she should never bring him to justice, and always prayed that his own conscience might be his only punishment. So, from the first, we saw that her heart was quite broken, for she would never speak nor look up, nor let me do the smallest thing for her, but always said that it was not fit that I should wait on such a one as she. Well, one night, after we were all abed, a letter was flung in at the window of Jessie's closet, and she crept out of her bed to take it. I can show it you, miss, for it was under her pillow when she died." Margaret, unlocking a drawer, took out a letter and gave it to Laura, who read in it these words: "My dear Jessie, I am the most miserable wretch upon earth. I wish I had been upon the rack the hour I met you. I am sure I have been so ever since. Do not curse me, dear Jessie. Upon my soul, I had far less thought of being the ruffian I have been to you than I have at this moment of blowing out my own brains. I wish to heaven that I had been in your own station, that I might have made you amends for the injury I have done. But you know it is impossible for me to marry you. I enclose a bank bill for £100, and I will continue to pay you the same sum annually while you live, though you should never consent to see me more. If you make me a father, no expense shall be spared to provide the means of secrecy and comfort. No accommodation which a wife could have shall be withheld from you. Tell me if there be anything more that I can do for you. I shall never forgive myself for what I have done. I abhor myself, and from this hour I forswear all womankind for your sake. Once more, dear Jessie, pardon me, I implore you." This letter was without signature, but the handwriting was familiar to Laura, and could not be mistaken. It was Hargrave's. Shuddering at this new proof of his depravity, Laura inwardly offered a thanksgiving that she had escaped all connection with such a monster. "You may trust my friend with the wretch's name," said Harriet, anxious that Laura's conviction should be complete. she will make no imprudent use of it. I should never have known it myself, had it not been for this letter, answered Margaret. But my poor child wished to answer it, and she was not able to carry the answer itself, so she was obliged to ask her father to go with it. At first she made us both promise in the Bible never to bring him either to shame or punishment, and then she told us that it was that same Major Hargrave that used to speak her so fair. Here is the scroll that John took of her answer. Sir, I return your money, for it can be of no use where I am going. I will never curse you, but trust I shall to the last have pity on you, who had no pity on me. I fear your sorrow is not right repentance, for, if it was, you would never think of committing a new sin by taking your own life, but rather of making reparation for the great evil you have done. Not that I say this in respect of wishing to be your wife. My station makes that unsuitable, more especially now when I should be a disgrace to any man. And I must say, a wicked person would be as unsuitable among my friends, for my parents are honest persons, although their daughter is so unhappy as to bring shame on them. I shall not live long enough to disgrace them any further, so pray inquire no more of me, nor take the trouble to send me money, for I will not buy my coffin with the wages of shame, and I shall need nothing else. So, wishing that my untimely end may bring you to a true repentance, I remain, sir, the poor, dying, disgraced Jessie Wilson. Ah, miss, continued Margaret, wiping from the paper the drops which had fallen on it, my poor child's prophecy was true. She always said she would just live till her child was born, and then lay her dishonoured head and her broken heart in the grave. My lady and Miss Harriet there were very kind, and my young master himself was so good as to promise that he would act the part of a father to the little orphan, and he used to argue with her that she should submit to the chastisement that was laid upon her, and that she might find some comfort still. But she always said that her chastisement was less than she deserved, and that she could never wish to live to be a very scorn of men, an outcast and an alien among her mother's children. So, the day that little Henry was born, she was doing so well that we were in hopes she would still be spared to us. But she knew better, and when I was sitting by her, she pulled me close to her and said, "Mother," says she, looking pleased like, "the time of my release is at hand now." And then she charged me never to give poor little Henry to his cruel father. I had not the power to say a word to her, but sat hushing the baby with my heart like to break. So, by and by, she said to me again, but very weak and low-like, "My brothers lie side by side in the churchyard. Lay me at their feet. It is good enough for me." So she never spoke more, but closed her eyes and slipped quietly away, and left her poor old mother. A long pause followed Margaret's melancholy tale. "Are you convinced, my friend?" said Mrs. Bolingbroke at length. "Fully," answered Laura, and returned to silent and thankful meditation. "My master," said Margaret, "has made good his promise to poor Jessie. He has shown a father's kindness to her boy. He paid for his nursing, and forces John to take a board for him that might serve any gentleman's son. And now it will be very hard if the end of all his goodness is to get himself ill spoken of, and nobody saying a word against him that was beginning of all this mischief. But that is the way of the world." "It is so," said Laura. "And what can better warn us that earth was never meant for our resting place? The raven wings his way through it triumphant. The dove finds no rest for the sole of her foot, and turns to the ark from whence she came." Mrs. Bolingbroke soon took leave of her nurse, and the ladies proceeded in their walk towards Walburn. Harriet continued to express the warmest detestation of the profligacy of Hargrave, while Laura's mind was chiefly occupied in endeavouring to account for De Courcy's desire to conceal from her the enormity which had just come to her knowledge. Unable to divine his reason, she applied to Harriet. "Why, my dear," said she, should your brother have silenced you on a subject which could only be mentioned to his honour?" "He never told me his reasons," said Harriet, smiling. "But if you will not be too angry, I may try to guess them." "I think," said Laura, "that thus cautioned I may contrive to keep my temper, so speak boldly." "Then, my dear," said Harriet, "I may venture to say that I think he suspected you of a partiality for this wretch, and would not shock you by a full disclosure of his depravity. And I know," added she in a voice tremulous with emotion, "that in him this delicacy was virtue, for the peace of his life depends on securing your affectionate, your exclusive preference." "Oh, Harriet, you have guessed right. Yes, I see it all. Dear, generous De Courcy," cried Laura, and burst into tears. Harriet had not time to comment upon this agitation, for the next moment De Courcy himself was at her side. For the first time, Laura felt embarrassed and distressed by his presence. The words she had just uttered still sounded in her ear, and she trembled lest they had reached that of De Courcy. She was safe. Her exclamation was unheard by Montague, but he instantly observed her tears, and they banished from his mind every other idea than that of Laura in sorrow. He paid his compliments like one whose attention was distracted, and scarcely answered what his sister addressed to him. Mrs. Bolingbroke, inwardly enjoying his abstraction and Laura's embarrassment, determined not to spoil an opportunity which she judged so favourable to her brother's suit. "This close walk," she said with a sly smile, "was never meant for a trio. It is just fit for a pair of lovers. Now I have letters to write, and if you two will excuse me—" De Courcy, colouring crimson, had not presence of mind to make any reply, while Laura, though burning with shame and vexation, answered with her habitual self-command, "Oh, pray, my dear, use no ceremony. There are none but friends." The emphasis which he lay upon the last word wrung a heavy sigh from De Courcy, who, while his sister was taking leave, was renewing his resolution not to disappoint the confidence of Laura. The very circumstances which Mrs. Bolingbroke had expected should lead to a happy éclaircissement made this interview the most reserved and comfortless which the two friends had ever had. Laura was too conscious to talk of the story which she had just heard, and she was too full of it to enter easily upon any other subject. With her gratitude for the delicacy which De Courcy had observed towards her, was mingled a keen feeling of humiliation at the idea that he had discovered her secret before it had been confided to him, for we can sometimes confess a weakness which we cannot without extreme mortification see detected. Her silence and depression infected De Courcy, and the few short constrained sentences which were spoken during their walk formed a contrast to the general vivacity of their conversations. Laura, however, recovered her eloquence as soon as she found herself alone with Lady Pelham. With all the animation of sensibility, she related the story of the ill-fated Jessie, and disclosing in confidence the name of her destroyer, drew, in the fullness of her heart, a comparison between the violator of laws human and divine, owing his life to the mercy of the wretch whom he had undone, and the kind adviser of inexperienced youth, the humane protector of forsaken infancy. Lady Pelham quietly heard her to an end, and then, wrinkling her eyelids, peeping through them with her glittering blue eyes, she began, "Do you know, my dear, I never met with prejudices so strong as yours. When will you give over looking for prodigies? Would any mortal but you expect a gay young man to be as correct as yourself? As for your immaculate Mr. De Courcy, with his sage advices, I think it is 10 to 1 that he wanted to keep the girl for himself. Besides, I'll answer for it, Hargrave would have bid farewell to all his indiscretions if you would have married him." "Never name it, madam," cried Laura warmly, "if you would not banish me from your presence. His marriage with me would have been itself a crime aggravated by being, as if in mockery, consecrated to heaven. For my connection with such a person no name is vile enough." "Well, well," said Lady Pelham, shrugging her shoulders, "I prophesy that one day you will repent of having refused to share a title with the handsomest man in England." "All distinctions between right and wrong," returned Laura, "must first be blotted from my mind. The beauty of his person is no more to me than the shining colours of an adder, and the rank which your ladyship prizes so highly would but render me a more conspicuous mark for the infamy in which his wife must share." Awed by the lightnings of Laura's eye, Lady Pelham did not venture to carry the subject further for the present. She had of late been watching an opportunity of procuring the readmission of Hargrave to the presence of his mistress, but this fresh discovery had served, if possible, to widen the breach. Hargrave's fiery temper submitted with impatience to the banishment which he had so well deserved, and he constantly urged Lady Pelham to use her authority on his behalf. Lady Pelham, though conscious that this authority had no existence, was flattered by having power ascribed to her, and promised, at some convenient season, to interfere. Finding herself, however, considerably embarrassed by a promise which she could not fulfil without hazarding the loss of Laura, she was not sorry that an opportunity occurred of evading the performance of her agreement. She therefore acquainted Hargrave with Laura's recent discovery, declaring that she could not ask her niece to overlook entirely so great an irregularity. From a regard to the promise of secrecy which she had given to Laura, as well as in common prudence, Lady Pelham had resolved not to mention the De Courcy family as the fountain from which she had drawn her intelligence. Principle and prudence sometimes governed her ladyship's resolutions, but seldom swayed her practice. In the first interview with Hargrave which followed this rational determination, she was led by the mere vanity of a blabber to give such hints as not only enabled him to trace the story of his shame to Norwood, but inclined him to fix the publishing of it upon Montague. From the moment when Hargrave first unjustly suspected Laura of a preference for De Courcy, his heart had rankled with an enmity which a sense of ingratitude served only to aggravate. The cool disdain with which De Courcy treated him, a strong suspicion of his attachment, above all Laura's avowed esteem and regard, inflamed this enmity to the bitterest hatred. Hopeless as he was of succeeding in his designs by any fair or honourable means, he might have entertained thoughts of relinquishing his suit, and of seeking, in a match of interest, the means of escape from his embarrassments. But that Laura, with all her unequalled charms, should be the prize of De Courcy, that in her he should obtain all that beauty, affluence, and love could give, was a thought not to be endured. Lady Pelham, too, more skilled to practise on the passions of others than to command her own, was constantly exciting him by hints of De Courcy's progress in the favour of Laura, while Lambert, weary of waiting for the tedious accomplishment of his own scheme, constantly goaded him, with sly sarcasms on his failures in the arts of persuasion, and on his patience in submitting to be baffled in his wishes by a haughty girl. In the heat of his irritation, Hargrave often swore that no power on earth should long delay the gratification of his love and his revenge. But to marry a free-born British woman against her consent is, in these enlightened times, an affair of some difficulty, and Hargrave, in his cooler moments, perceived that the object of 3 years' eager pursuit was farther than ever from its attainment. Fortune seemed in every respect to oppose the fulfilment of his designs, for his regiment at this time received orders to prepare to embark for America, and Lord Lincourt, who had discovered his nephew's ruinous connection with Lambert, had influence to procure, from high authority, a hint that Hargrave would be expected to attend his duty on the other side of the Atlantic. The news of this arrangement Hargrave immediately conveyed to Lady Pelham, urging her to sanction any means which could be devised for making Laura the companion of his voyage. Lady Pelham hesitated to carry her complaisance so far, but she resolved to make the utmost use of the time which intervened to promote the designs of her favourite. Her ladyship was not at any time much addicted to the communication of pleasurable intelligence, and the benevolence of her temper was not augmented by a prospect of the defeat of a plan in which her vanity was so much interested. She therefore maliciously withheld from her niece a piece of information so likely to be heard with joy. It reached Laura, however, by means of one who was ever watchful for her gratification. De Courcy no sooner ascertained the truth of the report than he hastened to convey it to Laura. He found her alone, and was welcomed with all her accustomed cordiality. "I am sorry," said he, with a smile which contradicted his words, "I am sorry to be the bearer of bad news to you, but I could not deny myself the edification of witnessing your fortitude. Do you know that you are on the point of losing the most assiduous admirer that ever woman was blessed with? In 3 weeks Colonel Hargrave embarks for America." Nay, do not look incredulous. I assure you it is true." "Thank heaven!" cried Laura. "I shall once more be at peace and safety." "Oh, fie! Is this your regret for so ardent a lover? Have you no feeling?" "Just such a feeling as that poor man had when he escaped from beneath the sword that hung by a hair. Indeed, Mr. de Courcy, I cannot tell you to what degree he has embittered the last 2 years of my life. But I believe," continuing she, blushing very deeply, "I need not explain to you any of my feelings towards Colonel Hargrave, since I find you have I know not what strange faculty of divining them." Assisted by a conversation which he had had with his sister, De Courcy easily understood Laura's meaning. Respectfully taking her hand, "Pardon me," he said in a low voice, "if I have ever ventured to guess what it was your wish to conceal from me." "Oh, believe me," cried Laura, with a countenance and manner of mingled candour and modesty, "there is not a thought of my heart which I wish to conceal from you, since, from you, even my most humbling weaknesses are sure of meeting with delicacy and indulgence. But since you are so good an augur," added she, with an ingenuous smile, "I trust you perceive that I shall need no more delicacy or indulgence upon the same score." The fascinating sweetness of her looks and voice, for the first time, beguiled De Courcy of his promised caution. "Dear, dear Laura!" he cried, fondly pressing her hand to his breast. "It is I who have need of indulgence, and I must sue for it. I must repeat to you that—" Laura's heart sprung to her lips, and unconsciously snatching away her hand, she stood in breathless expectation of what was to follow. "Madman that I am!" cried De Courcy, recalled to recollection by her gesture. "Whither am I venturing?" That was precisely what, of all things, Laura was most desirous to know, and she remained with her eyes fixed on the ground, half dreading the confidence, half the timidity of her lover. A momentary glance at the speaking countenance of Laura, glowing with confusion, yet brightened with trembling pleasure, awakened the strongest hopes that ever had warmed De Courcy's bosom. "Beloved Laura," said he, again tenderly approaching her, "remember I am but human. Cease to treat me with this beguiling confidence. Cease to bewitch me with these smiles, which are so like all that I wish, or suffer me to—" Laura started, as her attention was drawn by some one passing close to the ground window near which they were standing. "Ah!" cried she, in a tone of vexation, "there is my evil genius! Colonel Hargrave has come into the house. He will be here this instant. Excuse me for driving you away. I beseech you, do not remain a moment alone with him." Laura was not mistaken. She had scarcely spoken, ere, with a dark cloud on his brow, Hargrave entered. He bowed to Laura, who was advancing toward the door. "I am afraid, madam, I interrupt you," said he, darting a ferocious scowl upon De Courcy. Laura, without deigning even a single glance in reply, left the room. Hargrave, as he passed the window, had observed the significant attitude of the lovers, and his jealousy and rage were inflamed to the uttermost by the scorn which he had endured in the presence of his rival. Fiercely stalking up to De Courcy, "Is it to you, sir," said he, "that I am indebted for this insolence?" "No, sir," answered De Courcy, a little disdainfully. "I have not the honor of regulating Miss Montraville's civilities." "This is a paltry evasion," cried Hargrave. "Is it not to your misrepresentations of a youthful indiscretion that I owe Miss Montraville's present displeasure?" "I am not particularly ambitious of the character of an informer," answered De Courcy, and taking his hat, wished Hargrave a stately good morning. "Stay, sir!" cried Hargrave, roughly seizing him by the arm. "I must have some further conversation with you. You don't go yet." "I am not disposed to ask your permission," returned De Courcy, and coolly liberating his arm, walked out of the house. Boiling with rage, Hargrave followed him. "It is easy to see, sir," said he, "from whence you borrow a spirit that never was natural to you. Your presumption builds upon the partiality of that fickle, capricious woman. But observe, sir, that I have claims on her, claims which she herself was too happy in allowing, and no man shall dare to interfere with them." "I shall dare," returned De Courcy, anger kindling in his eyes. to inquire by what right you employ such expressions in regard to Miss Montraville, and whether my spirit be my own or not, you shall find it sufficient to prevent your holding such language in my presence." "In your presence, or the presence of all the devils," cried Hargrave, "I will maintain my right. And if you fancy that it interferes with any claim of yours, you know how to obtain satisfaction. There is but one way to decide the business." "I am of your opinion," replied de Courcy, "that there is one way, provided that we can mutually agree to abide by it, and that is an appeal to Miss Montraville herself." Hargrave turned pale, and his lip quivered with rage. "A mode of decision, no doubt," said he, "which your vanity persuades you will be all in your favour. No, no, sir, our quarrel must be settled by means in which even your conceit cannot deny my equality." "By a brace of pistols, you mean, of course," said de Courcy coolly. "But I frankly tell you, Colonel Hargrave, that my notions must have changed before I can find the satisfaction of a gentleman in being murdered, and my principles before I shall seek it in murdering you." "Curse on your hypocrisy!" cried Hargrave. "Keep this canting to cousin girls, and let me avenge my wrongs like a man, or the world shall know you, sir." "Do you imagine," said de Courcy, with a smile of calm disdain, "that I am terrified into doing what I tell you I think wrong, by the danger of a little misrepresentation? You may, if you think fit, tell the world that I will not stake my life in a foolish quarrel, nor wilfully send an unrepentant sinner to his great account. And if you go on to ascribe for my forbearance any motive which is derogatory to my character, I may, if I think fit, obtain justice as a peaceable citizen ought, or I may leave you undisturbed the glory of propagating a slander which even you yourself believe to be groundless." De Courcy's coolness served only to exasperate his adversary. "Truce with this methodistic jargon," cried he fiercely. "It may impose upon women, but I see through it, sir. See that it is but a miserable trick to escape what you dare not meet." "Dare not!" cried de Courcy, lightnings flashing from his eye. "My nerves have failed me, then, since—" He stopped abruptly, for he scorned at such a moment to remind his antagonist of the courageous effort to which he owed his life. "Since when?" cried Hargrave, more and more enraged, as the recollection which de Courcy had recalled placed before him the full turpitude of his conduct. "Do you think I owe you thanks for a life which you have made a curse to me, by cheating me of its dearest pleasures? But may tortures be my portion if I do not foil you." The latter part of this dialogue was carried on in a close shady lane which branched off from the avenue of Walburn. The dispute was proceeding with increasing warmth on both sides, when it was interrupted by the appearance of Laura. From a window she had observed the gentlemen leave the house together, had watched Hargrave's angry gestures, and seen de Courcy accompany him into the by-path. The evil which she had so long dreaded seemed now on the point of completion, and alarm leaving no room for reserve, she followed them with her utmost speed. "Oh, Mr. de Courcy!" she cried, with a look and attitude of most earnest supplication, "for mercy, leave this madman. If you would not make me for ever miserable, carry this no farther, I entreat, I implore you. Fear for me, if you fear not for yourself." The tender solicitude for the safety of his rival, which Hargrave imagined her words and gestures to express, the triumphant delight which they called up to the eyes of de Courcy, exasperated Hargrave beyond all bounds of self-command. Frantic with jealous and rage, he drew, and rushed fiercely on de Courcy. But Montague, having neither fear nor anger to disturb his presence of mind, parried the thrust with his cane, closed with his adversary before he could recover, wrested the weapon from his hand, and having calmly ascertained that no person could be injured by its fall, threw it over the fence into the adjoining field. Then, taking Hargrave aside, he whispered that he would immediately return to him, and, giving his arm to Laura, led her toward the house. She trembled violently, and big tears rolled down her colourless cheeks as, vainly struggling with her emotion, she said, "Surely you would not endanger a life so precious, so—" She was unable to proceed, but laying her hand on de Courcy's arm, she raised her eyes to his face, with such a look of piteous appeal as reached his very soul. Enchanted to find his safety the object of such tender interest, he again forgot his caution, and fondly supporting with his arm the form which seemed almost sinking to the earth. "What danger would I not forego," he cried, "to purchase such concern as this? Be under no alarm, dear Miss Montraville. Even if my sentiments in regard to duelling were other than they are, no provocation should tempt me to implicate your revered name in a quarrel which would, from its very nature, become public." Somewhat tranquilized by his words, Laura walked silently by his side till they reached the house, when, in a cheerful tone, he bade her farewell. "A short farewell," said he, "for I must see you again this evening." Laura could scarcely prevail on herself to part from him. "May I trust you?" said she, with a look of anxiety that spoke volumes. "Securely, dearest Laura," answered he. "He whom you trust needs no other motive for rectitude." He then hastened from her into the field, whither he had thrown Hargrave's sword, and having found it, sprung over into the lane where he had left its owner. Gracefully presenting it to him, De Courcy begged pardon for having deprived him of it, "though," added he, "I believe you are now rather disposed to thank me for preventing the effects of a momentary irritation." Hargrave took his sword, and in surly silence walked on. Then, suddenly stopping, he repeated that there was only one way in which the quarrel could be decided, and asked De Courcy whether he was determined to refuse him satisfaction. "The only satisfaction," returned De Courcy, "which is consistent with my notions of right and wrong, I will give you now on the spot. It is not to my information that you owe Miss Montraville's displeasure. Circumstances, which I own were wholly foreign to any consideration of your interests, induced me to keep your secret almost as if it had been my own, and it is from others that she has learnt a part of your conduct which, you must give me leave to say, warrants, even on the ground of modern honour, my refusal to treat you as an equal." "Insolent!" cried Hargrave. "Leave me, avoid me, if you would not again provoke me to chastise you, unarmed as you are." "My horses wait for me at the gate," said De Courcy, coolly proceeding by his side, "and your way seems to lie in the same direction as mine." The remainder of the way was passed in silence. At the gate, De Courcy, mounting his horse, bid his rival good morning, which the other returned with an ungracious bow. De Courcy rode home, and Hargrave, finding himself master of the field, returned to Walborne. There he exerted his utmost influence with Lady Pelham to procure an opportunity of excusing himself to Laura. Lady Pelham confessed that she could not venture to take the tone of command, lest she should drive Laura to seek shelter elsewhere, but she promised to contrive an occasion for an interview which he might prolong at his pleasure, provided such a one could be found without her apparent interference. With this promise he was obliged for the present to content himself, for, during his stay, Laura did not appear. She passed the day in disquiet. She could not rest. She could not employ herself. She dreaded lest the interview of the morning should have been only preparatory to one of more serious consequence. She told herself 100 times that she was sure of De Courcy's principles, and yet feared as if they had been unworthy of confidence. He had promised to see her in the evening, and she anxiously expected the performance of his promise. She knew that if he came while Lady Pelham was in the way, her ladyship would be too vigilant a guard to let one confidential word be exchanged. She therefore, with a half-pardonable cunning, said not a word of De Courcy's promised visit, and as soon as her aunt betook herself to her afternoon's nap, stole from the drawing-room to receive him. Yet perhaps she never met him with less semblance of cordiality. She blushed and stammered while she expressed her hopes that the morning's dispute was to have no further consequences, and apologized for the interest she took in it, in language more cold than she would have used to a mere stranger. Scarcely could the expression of tenderness have delighted the lover like this little ill-concealed affectation, the first and last which he had ever witnessed in Laura Montraville. "Ah, dearest Laura," cried he, "it is too late to retract. You have said that my safety was dear to you. Own that it was for me you feared this morning, and you shall not cancel your confession." Laura's colour deepened to crimson, but she made no other reply. Then, with a more timid voice and air, De Courcy said, "I would have told you then what dear presumptuous hopes your anxiety awakened, but that I feared to extort from your agitation what perhaps a cooler moment might refuse me. My long-loved, ever dear Laura, will you pardon me these hopes? Will you not speak to me? Not one little word to tell me that I am not too daring?" Laura spoke not even that little word. She made a faint struggle to withdraw the hand which De Courcy pressed. Yet the lover read the expressions on her half-averted face, and was satisfied. End of Chapter 30. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 31 of Self-Control, a Novel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Self-Control, a novel by Mary Brunton. Chapter 31. "Pray," said Lady Pelham to her niece, "what might you and your paragon be engaged in for the hour and a half you were together this evening?" "We were discussing a very important subject, madam," answered Laura, mustering all her confidence. "May I be permitted to inquire into the nature of it?" returned Lady Pelham, covering her spleen with a thin disguise of ceremony. "Certainly, madam," replied Laura. "You may remember I once told you that if I ever received addresses which I could with honour reveal, I should bespeak your ladyship's patience for my tale. Mr. De Courcy was talking of marriage, madam, and I... "Oh, mighty well, Miss Montraville," cried Lady Pelham, swelling with rage. "I comprehend you perfectly. You may spare your modesty. Keep all these airs and blushes till you tell Colonel Hargrave that all your fine, high-flown passion for him has been quite at the service of the next man you met with." Laura's eyes filled with tears of mortification, yet she meekly answered, "I am conscious that the degrading attachment of which I was once the sport merits your upbraidings, and indeed they have not been its least punishment." She paused for a moment, and then added with an insinuating smile, "I can bear that you should reproach me with my new choice, for inconstancy is the prescriptive right of woman, and nothing else can be objected to my present views." "Oh, far be it from me," cried Lady Pelham, scorn and anger throwing her whole little person into active motion. "Far be it from me to make any objection to your immaculate swain. I would have you understand, however, that no part of my property shall go to enrich a parcel of proud beggars. It was indeed my intention, if you had made a proper match, to give you the little all that I have to bestow. But if you prefer starving with your Methodist parson to being the heiress of £45,000, I have no more to say. However, you had better keep your own secret. The knowledge of it might probably alter Mr. De Courcy's plans a little." "Your ladyship," answered Laura with spirit, "has good access to know that the love of wealth has little influence on my purposes, and I assure you that Mr. De Courcy would scorn upon any terms to appropriate what he considers as the unalienable right of your own child. Though we shall not be affluent, we shall be too rich for your charity, and that is the only claim in which I could compete with Mrs. Herbert." This mention of her daughter exasperated Lady Pelham to fury. In a voice half choked with passion, she cried, "Neither that rebellious wretch nor any of her abettors or imitators shall ever have countenance or assistance from me. No, not though they should beg with their starved bantlings from door to door." To this intemperate speech Laura made no reply, but quietly began to pour out the tea. Lady Pelham continued to hurry up and down the room, chafing and venting her rage in common abuse. For a scold in the drawing-room is not very unlike a scold at a green stall. The storm, meeting with no opposition, at length spent itself, or subsided into short growlings, uttered at the intervals of a surly silence. To these, as no answer was absolutely necessary, none was returned. Laura did not utter a syllable, till Lady Pelham's wrath beginning to give place to her curiosity, she turned to her niece, saying, Pray, Miss Montraville, when and where is this same wise marriage of yours to take place?" "The time is not quite fixed, madam," answered Laura. "As soon as you can conveniently spare me, I intend going to Scotland, and when you and Mrs. de Courcy wish me to return, Mr. de Courcy will escort me back." "I spare you?" returned Lady Pelham with a sneer. "Oh, ma'am, if that is all, pray don't let me retard your raptures. You may go tomorrow or tonight, ma'am, if you please. Spare you, indeed. Truly, while I can afford to pay a domestic, I need not be dependent on your assistance. And in attachment or gratitude, any common servant may supply your place." The rudeness and ingratitude of this speech again forced the tears to Laura's eyes, but she mildly replied, "Well, madam, as soon as you find a substitute for me, I shall be ready to depart." Then, to escape further insult, she quitted the room. Lady Pelham's wrath at the derangement of her plan would not suffer her to rest till she had communicated the disaster to Colonel Hargrave. Early next morning, accordingly, she dispatched a note requiring his immediate presence at Walborne. He obeyed the summons, and was as usual privately received by Lady Pelham. He listened to her intelligence with transports of rage rather than of sorrow. He loaded his rival with execrations, declaring that he would rather see Laura torn in pieces than know her to be the wife of de Courcy. He swore that he would circumvent their schemes, and that though his life should be the forfeit, he would severely revenge the sufferings he had endured. Lady Pelham had not courage to encounter the evil spirit which she had raised. Subdued and crouching before his violence, she continued to give a terrified assent to every extravagance he uttered, till he announced his resolution of seeing Laura on the instant, that he might know whether she dared to confirm this odious tale. Lady Pelham then ventured to represent to him that Laura might be so much offended by this breach of contract as to take refuge with Mrs. de Courcy, a measure which would oppose a new obstacle to any scheme for breaking off the intended marriage. She assured him that she would grant every reasonable assistance in preventing a connection so injurious to her niece's interest, though she knew Laura's obstinacy of temper too well to hope anything from direct resistance. She hinted that it would be most prudent to give the desired interview the appearance of accident, and she promised to contrive the occasion as soon as Hargrave was sufficiently calm to consider of improving it to best advantage. But calm was a stranger to the breast of Hargrave. The disquiet which is the appointed portion of the wicked raged there beyond control. To the anguish of disappointed were added the pangs of jealousy and the heart-burnings of hatred and revenge. Even the loss of the object of 3 years' eager pursuit was less cutting than the success of de Courcy, and the pain of a forfeiture, which was the just punishment of a former crime, was heightened to agony by the workings of such passions as consummate the misery of fiends. The associates of the wicked must forego the consolations of honest sympathy. All Hargrave's tortures were aggravated by the sarcasms of Lambert, who, willing to hasten the fever to its crisis, goaded him with coarse comments upon the good fortune of his rival, and advices, which he well knew would act in direction opposite to their seeming purpose, to desist from further competition. After spending 24 hours in alternate fits of rage and despair, Hargrave returned to Lady Pelham, informing her that, whatever were the consequences, he would no longer delay seeing Laura. Lady Pelham had foreseen his demand, and though not without fear of the event, had prepared for compliance. She had already arranged her scheme, and the execution was easy. Laura's favourite walk in the shrubbery led to a little summer-house, concealed in a thicket of acacias. Thither Lady Pelham had conveyed some dried plants, and had requested Laura's assistance in classing them. Laura had readily agreed, and that very morning had been allotted for the task. Lady Pelham, having first directed Hargrave where to take his station, accompanied her unsuspecting niece to the summer house, and there for a while joined in her employment. Soon, however, feigning a pretext for half an hour's absence, she quitted Laura, intending at first to loiter in the shrubbery, as a kind of safeguard against the ill consequences of her imprudent connivance, but meeting with a gardener who was going to transplant a bed of favourite auricula's, she followed him to watch over their safety, leaving her niece to guard her own. Scarcely had Laura been a minute alone ere she was startled by the entrance of Hargrave, and seriously alarmed by seeing him lock the door and deliberately secure the key. "What is it you mean, sir?" said she, trembling. "To decide your fate and mine," answered Hargrave, with a look and voice that struck terror to her soul. "I am told you are a bride, Laura," said he, speaking through his clenched teeth. "Say," continued he, firmly grasping her arm, "speak, is it so?" "I know no right," said Laura, recovering herself, "that you have to question me, nor meanly thus to steal—" "No evasions," interrupted Hargrave in a voice of thunder. "I have rights, rights which I will maintain while I have being. Now tell me, if you dare, that you have transferred them to that abhorred—" He stopped, his utterance choked by the frenzy into which he had worked himself. "What has transported you to this fury, Colonel Hargrave?" said Laura calmly. "Surely you must be sensible that whatever claims I might once have allowed you have long since been made void by your own conduct. I will not talk to you of principle, though that were of itself sufficient to sever us forever. But ask yourself what right you can retain over the woman whom you have insulted and forsaken and oppressed and outraged." "Spare your taunts, Laura. They will only embitter the hour of retribution, and may hell be my portion if I be not richly repaid for all the scorn you have heaped upon me. I will be revenged, proud woman. You shall be at my mercy, where no cool canting villain can wrest you from me." His threats and the frightful violence with which they were uttered filled Laura with mingled dread and pity. "Command yourself, I beseech you, Colonel Hargrave," said she. "If you resent the pain which, believe me, I have most unwillingly occasioned, you are amply revenged. You have already caused me sufferings which mock description." "Yes, yes, I know it," cried Hargrave in a milder voice. "You were not then so hard. You could feel when that vile wanton first seduced me from you. Then think what I now endure, when this cold-blooded— But may I perish if I do not snatch this prize from him. And think not of resistance, Laura, for by all that I have suffered, resistance shall be vain." "Why do you talk so dreadfully to me?" cried Laura, making a trembling effort to release her arm, which he still firmly grasped. Why will you not cease to persecute me? I have never injured you. I have forgiven, pitied, prayed for you. How have I deserved this worse than savage cruelty?" "Laura," said Hargrave, moved by the pleadings of a voice which would have touched a murderer's heart, "you have still a choice. Promise to be mine. Permit me only, by slow degrees, to regain what I have lost. Say that months, that years hence you will consent, and you are safe." "Impossible," cried Laura. "I cannot bind myself. Nor could you trust a promise extorted by fear. Yet be but half what I once thought you, and I will esteem—" "Esteem?" interrupted Hargrave with a ghastly smile. "Yes, and shrink from me as you do now, while you hang on that detested wretch, till even his frozen heart warmed to passion. No," continued he, with an awful adjuration, "though the deed bring me to the scaffold, you shall be mine. You shall be my wife too, Laura. but not till you have besought me. Suit at my feet for the title you have so often despised. I will be master of your fate, of that reputation, that virtue which you worship, and your minion shall know it, that he may writhe under jealousy and disappointment." "Powers of mercy!" cried Laura, raising her eyes in strong compunction. "Have I made this mine idol?" Then turning on Hargrave a look of deep repentance, "Yes," she continued, "I deserve to see thee as thou art, without mitigation vile, since on thee my sacrilegious heart bestowed such love as was due to the Infinite alone." "Oh, Laura!" cried Hargrave, softened by the remembrance of her youthful affection, "let but one faint spark of that love revive, and I will forget all your scorns, and feel again such gentle wishes as blessed our first hours of tenderness. Or only swear that you will renounce that bane of my existence, that you will shrink from him, shun him like a serpent. Or give me your word only, and I will trust it. Your liberty, your person shall be as sacred as those of angels. Promise them." "Why do you attempt to terrify me?" said Laura, her indignation rising as her alarm subsided. "I have perhaps no longer the right, even if I had the inclination, to utter such a vow. I trust that, in this land of freedom, I am safe from your violence. My reputation, frail as it is, you cannot harm without permission from on high, and if, for wise purposes, the permission be given, I doubt not that I shall be enabled to bear unjust reproach, nay, even to profit by the wrong." Hargrave suffered her to conclude. Rage bereft him, for a time, of the power of utterance. Then, bursting into a torrent of reproach, he upbraided her in a language the most insulting. "Do you dare to own," said he, "that your base inclinations favor that abhorred, that this accursed marriage is your choice, your free choice?" He paused in vain for a reply. Laura would not irritate him further, and scorned to disguise the truth. "Then, Laura," said he, and he confirmed the sentence with a dreadful oath, "you have sealed your fate. Think you that your De Courcy shall foil me? By heaven, I will see you perish first. I will tear you from him, though I answer it with my life and soul. Let this be the pledge of my triumph." And he made a motion to clasp her rudely in his arms. With a cry of dread and horror, Laura sprang from him, and throwing open the casement, called loudly for assistance. Hargrave forced her back. "Spare your alarms, my lovely proud one," said he with a smile, which made her blood run cold. "You are safe till we meet where cries will be useless. What, may I not even kiss this pretty hand, as earnest that you shall soon be mine beyond the power of fate?" "Silence, audacious!" cried Laura, bursting into tears of mingled fear and indignation, while she struggled violently to disengage her hands. "Nay, this rosy cheek will content me better," cried Hargrave, and was again attempting to clasp her, when the door was burst suddenly open, and De Courcy appeared. "Ruffian!" he exclaimed, approaching Hargrave, who, in his surprise, permitted his prey to escape. Her fears now taking a new direction, Laura flew to intercept De Courcy. "Ah," she cried, "my folly has done this. Fly from this madman, I entreat you. I have nothing to fear but for you. Begone, I implore you." "And leave you to such treatment? Not while I have life. When you choose to go, I will attend you. For you, sir. But I must stoop below the language of a gentleman, ere I find words to describe your conduct." "For heaven's sake," cried Laura, "dear De Courcy, provoke him no further. Let us fly this place." And clinging to De Courcy's arm, she drew him on, while, with the other, he defended her from Hargrave, who had advanced to detain her. Her expression of regard, her confiding attitude, exasperated the frenzy of Hargrave to the uttermost. Almost unconscious of his actions, he drew a pistol from his pocket and fired. Laura uttered a cry of terror, clasping her lover's arm more closely to her breast. "Be not alarmed, love," whispered de Courcy. "It is nothing." And staggering forward a few paces, he fell to the ground. Laura, in desperation, rushed from the summer house, calling wildly for help. Then, struck with the fearful thought that Hargrave might complete his bloody work, she hastened back. During the few moments of her absence, de Courcy addressed his murderer, whose rage had given place to a mild stupor. "I fear this is an unlucky stroke, Hargrave. Save yourself. My horse is at the gate." Hargrave answered only with a groan, and striking his clenched hand on his forehead, turned away. His crime was unpremeditated. No train of self-deceit had reconciled his conscience to its atrocity. The remembrance of the courage which had saved his life, the generous concern of de Courcy for his safety, humility, the last virtue which utterly forsakes us, all awakened him to remorse, keen and overwhelming, like every other passion of Hargrave. Not bearing to look upon his victim, he stood fixed and motionless, while Laura, on her knees, watched in dismay the changing countenance of de Courcy, and strove to staunch the blood which was streaming from his wound. De Courcy once more tried to cheer Laura with words of comfort. "Were it not," said he, "for the pleasure this kind gives me, I might tell you that I do not suffer much pain. I am sure I could rise if I could trust this slender arm," laying his hand gently upon it. Laura eagerly offered her assistance as he attempted to raise himself, but the effort overpowered him, and he sunk back fainting. In the strong language of terror, Laura besought Hargrave to procure help. Still motionless, his forehead resting against the wall, his hands clenched as in convulsion, Hargrave seemed not to heed her entreaties. "Have you no mercy?" cried she, clasping the arm from which she had so lately shrunk in horror. "He saved your life. Will you let him perish without aid?" "Off, woman!" cried Hargrave, throwing her from him. "Thy witchcraft has undone me." And he distractedly hurried away. Laura's terror was not the passive cowardice of a feeble mind. She was left alone to judge, to act for herself, for more than herself. Immediate, momentous decision was necessary, and she did decide by an effort of which no mind enfeebled by sloth or selfishness would have been capable. She saw that loss of blood was the cause of de Courcy's immediate danger, a danger which might be irremediable before he could receive assistance from more skillful hands than hers. Such remedy, then, as she could command, she hastened to apply. To the plants which their beauty had recommended to Lady Pelham, Laura had added a few of which the usefulness was known to her. Agaric of the oak was of the number, and she had often applied it where many a hand less fair would have shrunk from the task. Nor did she hesitate now. The ball had entered near the neck, and the feminine, the delicate Laura, herself disengaging the wound from its coverings, the feeling, the tender Laura, herself performed an office from which false sensibility would have recoiled in horror. She was thus employed when she was found by a woman whom Hargrave had met and sent to her assistance with an indistinct message, from which Laura gathered that he was gone in search of a surgeon. The woman no sooner cast her eyes on the bloody form of de Courcy and on the colourless face of Laura, more deathlike than his. With nosy imbecility she began to bewail and ejaculate. Laura, however, instantly put a stop to her exclamations by dispatching her for cordials and assistance. In a few minutes all the household was assembled round de Courcy. Yet such was the general curiosity, horror, or astonishment, that he would have remained unaided, but for the firmness of her who was most interested in the scene. She dismissed everyone whose presence was unnecessary, and silenced the rest by peremptory command. She administered a cordial to recruit the failing strength of De Courcy, and causing him to be raised to the posture which seemed the least painful, made her own trembling arms his support. Nothing further now remained to be done, and Laura began to feel the full horrors of her situation, to weigh the fearful probability that all her cares were vain, to upbraid herself as the cause of this dire tragedy. Her anguish was too great to find relief in tears. Pale and cold as marble, chilly drops bursting from her forehead, she sat in the stillness of him who waits the sentence of condemnation, save when a convulsive shudder expressed her suffering. The mournful quiet was interrupted by the entrance of Lady Pelham, who, quite out of breath, began a string of questions mixed with abundance of ejaculation. "Bless my soul!" she cried. "How has all this happened? For heaven's sakes, Laura, tell me the meaning of all this. Why don't you speak, girl? Good Lord! Could you not have prevented these madmen from quarreling? What brought De Courcy here? How did he find you out? Why don't you speak? Mercy on me, is the girl out of her senses?" The expression of deep distress with which Laura now raised her eyes reminded Lady Pelham of the sensibility requisite upon such an occasion, which her ladyship's curiosity had hitherto driven from her recollection. Approaching, therefore, to De Courcy, she took a hasty look at this dismal spectacle, and exclaiming, "Oh, what a sight is there! Unfortunate Laura, dear wretched girl!" she began first to sob and then to scream violently. Laura motioned to the attendants to lead her away, and she suffered them to do so without resistance. But she had no sooner crossed the threshold than, perceiving the spectators whom curiosity had collected in the shrubbery, she redoubled her shrieks, struggled, beat herself, and but for the untoward strength of her nerves, would have soon converted her pretended fit into reality. Wearied with her efforts, she was beginning to relax them, when the surgeon appeared, and her ladyship was more vociferous than ever. Mr. Raby, a quiet, sensible man, undertook her care before he proceeded to his more serious business, and either guided by his previous acquaintance with his patient, or by his experience in similar cases, gave a prescription which, though simple, was perfectly efficacious. He directed that the lady should be instantly secluded in her own chamber, with only one attendant, and the remedy proved so beneficial that her ladyship enjoyed a night of tranquil repose. He next turned his attention to De Courcy, and judging it proper to extract the ball without delay, advised Laura to retire. Without opposition she prepared to obey, and seeing De Courcy about to speak, put her hand on his lips to save him the exertion, and herself the pain of a farewell. Yet as she resigned her charge, raising her eyes to heaven, once more to commend De Courcy to the divine protection, the fervour of her supplication burst into words. "Oh, if it be possible, if it be possible!" she cried. "Yes, it is possible," said De Courcy, comprehending the unfinished sentence. "Your firmness, noble creature, has made it possible." Reproaching herself with having allowed De Courcy to perceive her alarm, she hastened away, and seating herself on the steps that led to the door, awaited in silence the event of the operation. Here, as she sorrowfully called to mind the various excellencies of De Courcy, his piety, his integrity, his domestic virtues, so lately known, so soon to be lost to her, she suddenly recollected the heavier calamity of the mother deprived of such a son, and perceived the inhumanity of permitting the stroke to fall without preparation. Having access to no messenger more tender than a common servant, she determined, though with unspeakable reluctance, herself to bear the tidings to Mrs. De Courcy. "I will know the worst," thought she, "and then—" She started at a faint noise that sounded from the summer-house. Steps approached the door from within. She sprung up, and the surgeon appeared. "I have the happiness to tell you," said he, "that if no fever takes place, our friend is safe." The chief danger has been from loss of blood, and your presence of mind. Ah, do you feel faint?" The awful interest which had supported the spirits of Laura thus suddenly withdrawn, the tide of various feeling overpowered them, and she sunk into one of those long and deep faintings which were now unhappily become in some degree constitutional with her. Mr. Raby, having given directions for her recovery, placed De Courcy in Lady Pelham's carriage, and himself attended him to Norwood, where he mitigated Mrs. De Courcy's horror and distress by assuring her of her son's safety, which he again delighted Montague by ascribing to the cares of Laura. It was late in the evening before Laura was sufficiently collected to review with composure the events of the day. As soon, however, as she was capable of considering all the circumstances, a suspicion occurred that her unfortunate interview with Hargrave had been sanctioned, if not contrived, by Lady Pelham. That he should know the place and the hour in which he might surprise her alone, that to this place, which because of its loneliness she had of late rather deserted, she should be conducted by her aunt, that at this moment she should, upon a trivial pretence, be left in solitude, seemed a coincidence too strong to be merely accidental. She recollected some symptoms of private communication between Lady Pelham and Hargrave. Suspicions of connivance in the infamous stratagem of her arrest again revived in her mind. Lady Pelham, she perceived, had afforded her a protection at best imperfect, perhaps treacherous. Hargrave's late threats, too, as she revolved them in her thoughts, appeared more like the intimations of settled design than the vague ravings of passion. Prudence, therefore, seemed to require that she should immediately provide for her own safety, and indignation at her aunt's breach of confidence hastened the purpose which she formed, to leave Walborne without delay. She determined to go the next morning to Norwood, there to remain till De Courcy showed signs of convalescence, and then perform her long-projected journey to Scotland. In order to avoid unpleasant altercation, she resolved to depart without warning Lady Pelham of her intention, merely announcing by letter the reasons of her conduct. The affectionate Laura would not have parted from the meanest servant without a kindly farewell, but her innate abhorrence of treachery steeled her heart, and she rejoiced that it was possible to escape all present intercourse with her deceitful kinswoman. As soon as the dawn appeared, she arose, and on her knees thankfully acknowledged the protecting care which had watched over her, since first, as a destitute orphan, she applied to Lady Pelham. She blessed the goodness which had softened in her favour a heart little subject to benevolent expressions, which had restored her in sickness, consoled her in sorrow, delivered her from the snares of the wicked, and opened for her the joys of virtuous friendship. And where is the wretch so miserable that he may not in the review of 18 months find subjects of gratitude still more numerous? Laura began no important action of her life without imploring a blessing on the event, and she now proceeded to commend herself and her future prospects to the same care of which she had glad experience. The proper business of the morning ended, she had begun to make arrangements for her immediate departure, when she heard Lady Pelham's bell ring, and the next instant heard a noise like that occasioned by the fall of something heavy. She listened for a while, but all was again still, the rest of the family yet buried in sleep, and Laura, hearing no one stirring to answer Lady Pelham's summons, began to fear that her aunt was ill, perhaps unable to make any further effort to procure assistance. At this idea, all her just indignation subsiding in a moment, she flew to Lady Pelham's chamber. Lady Pelham was lying on the floor, having apparently fallen in an attempt to rise from her bed. She was alive, though insensible, and her face, though altered, was still florid. Laura, soon procuring help, raised her from the ground, and guessing that apoplexy was her disorder, placed her in an upright posture, loosened her night-clothes, and having hurried away a servant for Mr. Raby, ventured, until his arrival, upon such simple remedies as she knew might be safely administered. In little more than an hour the surgeon arrived, and having examined the patient, declared her to be in extreme danger. Before he left her, however, he succeeded in restoring her to some degree of recollection, yet, far from changing his first opinion, he advised Laura to lose no time in making every necessary use of an amendment, which he feared would be only transient. From Lady Pelham he went to Norwood, and returning to Walborn in the evening, brought the pleasing intelligence that De Courcy continued to do well. This second visit produced no change in his sentiments, and he remained persuaded that though Lady Pelham might continue to linger for a time, the shock had been too great to allow of complete recovery. Laura now rejoiced that she had not executed her purpose of leaving Walborn, since, had her aunt's illness succeeded to the rage which her departure would have excited, she could never have ceased to blame herself as the cause. She looked with profound compassion, too, upon the condition of an unfortunate being whose deathbed was neither soothed by affection nor cheered by pious hope. Unhappy woman, thought she, as she sat watching an unquiet slumber into which her aunt had fallen, to whom the best gifts of nature and of fortune have, by some fatality, been useless, or worse than useless, whose affluence has purchased no higher joys than half-grudged luxuries, whose abilities have dazzled others and bewildered herself, but lent no steady light to guide her way, whose generosity has called forth no gratitude, whose kindness has awakened no affections, to whom length of days has brought no reverence, and length of intimacy no friends. Even the sacred ties of nature have been to her unblessed. Her only child, driven from her in anger, dares not approach to share the last sad offices with me, who in performing them must forgive as well as pity. Favourite of fortune, what has been wanting to thee save that blessing which bringeth no sorrow with it? But that blessing was light in thine esteem, and amidst the glitter of thy toys, the pearl of great price was disregarded. For some days Lady Pelham continued much in the same situation. She suffered no pain, yet gave no signs of amendment. On the 6th morning from her first attack, she grew suddenly and materially worse. It was soon discovered that her limbs were paralyzed, and the surgeon declared that her end could not be very distant. Her senses, however, again returned, and she continued free from pain. She showed little apprehension of her own danger, and Laura debated with herself whether she would permit her aunt to dream away the last precious hours of probation, or endeavour to awaken her to a sense of her condition. Laura had no faith in deathbed repentance. She knew that resolution of amendment, which there is no longer time to practice, and renunciation of sin, made under the immediate prospect of punishment, are at best suspicious. She knew that, in the ordinary course of Providence, the grace which has been long despised is at length justly withdrawn. Yet she saw that she had no right to judge Lady Pelham as wholly impenitent, and she considered a deathbed as highly suitable to the renewal, though not to the beginning, of repentance. She knew, too, that the call might be made effectual at the 11th hour, and the bare chance was worth the toil of ages. She felt how little she herself would have valued the mistaken pity which could suffer her to enter on the dark valley without a warning to cling closer to the staff and rod of comfort. She therefore ventured to hint gently to Lady Pelham the opinion of her medical friends, and to remind her of the duty of preparing for the worst. Lady Pelham at first appeared a good deal shocked, and lay for some time apparently meditating upon her situation. At last, recovering her spirits, she said, "Your nerves, Laura, were always so coarse that you seemed to me to take pleasure in thinking of shocking things. But I am sure it is abominably barbarous in you to tease me with them now I am ill. Do keep your horrid fancies to yourself, or keep away till you are cured of the vapours. I dare say it is your dismal face that makes me dream so unpleasantly." Laura, however, was not to be so discouraged. She took occasion to represent that no harm could ensue for preparing to meet the foe, since his march was not to be retarded by shutting our eyes on his advances, nor hastened by the daring which watched his approach. She at length thought she had succeeded in convincing her aunt of her danger. Lady Pelham said that she feared she was dying, and she believed that she said the truth. But Lady Pelham had had 60 years' practice in self-deceit. The fear might flutter in her imagination, but was not strong enough to touch her heart. Laura, however, made use of her acknowledgment to press upon her the duties of forgiveness and charity towards all mankind, and especially towards her child, reminding her of the affecting parity of situation between offending man and his disobedient offspring. Lady Pelham at first answered impatiently that she would not be argued on this subject, but as her spirits began to fail under the first confinement which she had ever endured, she became more tractable. "God knows," said she to Laura one day, "we all have much need to be forgiven, and therefore we must forgive in our turn. For my part, I am sure I die in charity with all mankind, and with that creature among the rest. However, I shall take my friend the spectator's advice, and remember the difference between giving and forgiving." Laura often begged permission to send for Mrs. Herbert, but Lady Pelham sometimes postponed it till she should get better, sometimes till she should grow worse. Laura was in the meantime her constant attendant, bearing with her peevishness, soothing her caprice, and striving to rouse in her feelings suitable to her condition. Finding, however, that she had made but little progress in her pious work, she begged that she might be allowed to take the assistance of a clergyman. "A clergyman, child!" cried Lady Pelham. "Do you imagine me to be a papist? Or do you think me capable of such weak superstition as to place more reliance on a parson's prayers than on yours or my maid Betty's? No, no, I trust I have been no worse than other people, and hope, though I may be weak, I shall never be fanatical. Besides, I have too high a sense of divine justice to think that our Maker would first give us ungovernable passions and then punish us for yielding to them. A phlegmatic being like you may, indeed, be called to strict account, but people of strong feelings must be judged by a different standard." "Oh, madam," said Laura, "be assured that our Maker gives us no unconquerable passions. If we ourselves have made them so, it becomes us to be humbled in the dust, not to glory in the presumptuous hope that He will soften the sanctions of His law to favor our remissness." Driven from the stronghold of justice, rather by the increase of her bodily languor than by the force of truth, the dying sinner had recourse to mercy. A mercy, however, of her own composing. "It is true," said she one day to Laura, "that I have done some things which I have reason to regret, and which, I must confess, deserve punishment. But divine mercy towards believers, we are told, is infinite. And though I may at times have doubted, I have never disbelieved." Laura, shuddering at this awful blindness, was striving to frame a useful reply, when she saw her aunt's countenance change. It was distorted by a momentary convulsion, and then fixed forever in the stillness of death. End of chapter 31, read by Mary in Arkansas.
Chapter 32 of Self-Control, a Novel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Self-Control, a Novel, by Mary Brunton. Chapter 32. Laura was more shocked than afflicted by the death of a person whom she was unable to love and had no reason to respect. She lost no time in conveying the news to Mrs. Herbert, begging that she would herself come and give the necessary directions. Thinking it proper to remain at Walborne till after her aunt's funeral, she refused Mrs. de Courcy's invitation to spend at Norwood the time which intervened. De Courcy continued to recover fast, and Laura, thinking she might soon leave him without anxiety, again fixed an early day for her journey to Scotland. Notwithstanding Laura's knowledge of the phlegmatic temperament of her cousin, she was surprised at the stoicism with which Mrs. Herbert supported the death of her mother. She examined the dead body with a cold comment on its appearance, gave orders for the interment in an unfaltering voice, and neither seemed to feel nor to affect the slightest concern. Nor did her philosophy appear to fail her one jot, when, upon opening the will, she was found to be left without inheritance. The paper, which had been drawn up a few months before, evinced Lady Pelham's adherence to her scheme for her niece's advancement, and this, with her obstinate enmity to Mrs. Herbert, furnished the only instance of her consistency or perseverance which were ever known to the world. Her whole property she bequeathed to Laura Montreville, and to her second son upon taking the name of Pelham, provided that Laura married Colonel Hargrave, or a peer, or the eldest son of a peer. But if she married a commoner, or remained unmarried, she was to inherit only £10,000, the bulk of the property going to a distant relation. The very hour that this will was made public, Laura informed the contingent heir that he might possess himself of his inheritance, since she would certainly never perform the conditions which alone could destroy his claim. Not acquiescing in the justice of excluding Mrs. Herbert from her natural rights, she would instantly have offered to share with her cousin the bequest of Lady Pelham. But considering that her engagement with De Courcy entitled him to decide on the disposal of whatever belonged to his future wife, she hastened to ask his sanction to her purpose. De Courcy, without hesitation, advised that the whole should be given up to its natural owner. "We shall have enough for humble comfort, dear Laura," said he, "and have no need to grasp at a doubtful claim." Laura, however, differed from him in opinion. She thought she might, in strict justice, retain part of the bequest of so near a relation, and she felt pleased to think that she should enter the De Courcy family not altogether portionless. She therefore reserved £2,000, giving up the rest unconditionally to Mrs. Herbert. These points being settled, nothing now remained to retard Laura's journey to Scotland. Mrs. De Courcy, indeed, urged her to postpone it till Montague should acquire a right to be her escort, but Laura objected that it was her wish to give a longer time to her old friend than she thought it proper to withdraw De Courcy from his business and his home. She reflected, too, with a light heart, that a protector in her journey was now less necessary, since her mad lover, as Harriet called Colonel Hargrave, had embarked for America. Laura had heard of his departure before her aunt's death, and she gladly observed that favorable winds were speeding him across the Atlantic. The day preceding that on which she meant to leave Walborne, she spent with Mrs. De Courcy and Montague, who, though not entirely recovered, was able to resume his station in the family room. De Courcy, with the enthusiasm of youth and love, spoke of his happy prospects. His mother, with the sober eye of experience, looked forward to joys as substantial, though less dazzling, while feminine modesty suppressed the pleasure with which Laura felt that she was necessary to these schemes of bliss. With the confidence of mutual esteem they arranged their plan of life, a plan at once embracing usefulness and leisure, retirement and hospitality. Laura consented that 1 month, one little month, should begin the accomplishment of these golden dreams, for she permitted De Courcy to follow her at the end of that time to Scotland. A few weeks they were to spend in wandering through the romantic scenes of her native land, and then join Mrs. De Courcy at Norwood, which was to continue her permanent abode. Laura remained with her friends till the evening was closing. Then, avoiding the solemnity of a farewell by a half-promise of stopping as she passed the next day, she sprung into Mrs. De Courcy's carriage and drove off. Tears rushed to De Courcy's eyes as the carriage was lost to his sight. "I am still weak," thought he as he dashed them away. "She will soon return to bring gladness to every heart, and double joy to mine. Tomorrow, too, I shall see her," thought he, yet he continued depressed, and soon retired to his chamber. Mrs. De Courcy and her son met early the next morning, expecting that Laura would early begin her journey. Montague stationed himself at the window to watch for her appearance, half fearing that she would not keep her promise, yet every minute repeating that it was impossible she could go without bidding farewell. The breakfast hour arrived, and still Laura came not. De Courcy, impatient, forgot his weakness, and insisted upon walking to the gate that he might inquire whether a carriage had passed from Walborn. He had scarcely left the house when old John, with a face that boded evil, hastily came to beg that his lady would speak with a servant of Lady Pelham's. Mrs. de Courcy, somewhat alarmed, desired that the servant might come in. "Please, madam," said he, "let me know where I may find Miss Montraville. The carriage has waited for her these 3 hours?" "Good heavens!" cried Mrs. de Courcy, in consternation. "Is Miss Montraville not at Walborn?" "No, madam, she has not been here since yesterday morning." Mrs. de Courcy, now in extreme alarm, summoned her coachman, and desired to know where he had left Miss Montraville the evening before. He answered that, at Laura's desire, he had set her down at the gate of Walborn, that he had seen her enter, and afterwards, in turning the carriage, had observed her walking along the avenue towards the house. Inexpressibly shocked, Mrs. de Courcy had yet the presence of mind to forbid alarming her son with these fearful tidings. As soon as she could recollect herself, she dispatched old Wilson, on whose discretion she thought she might rely, to inform de Courcy that a message from Walborn had made her cease to expect Laura's visit. Montague returned home, sad and disappointed. His melancholy questions and comments increased the distress of his mother. "Did she not even write 1 line?" said he. "Could you have believed that she would go without 1 farewell, that she could have passed our very gate?" "She was willing to spare you the pain of a farewell," said Mrs. de Courcy, checking the anguish of her heart. "She will write soon, I hope." But day after day passed, and Laura did not write. Mrs. de Courcy, still concealing from her son a misfortune which she thought him yet unequal to bear, used every possible exertion to trace the fugitive. She offered high rewards to whoever could afford the smallest clue to discovery. She advertised in every newspaper except that which de Courcy was accustomed to read. Her suspicions at first falling upon Hargrave, she caused particular inquiry to be made whether any of his domestics had been left in England with orders to follow him. But she found that he, with his whole suite, had sailed from Europe more than a fortnight before Lara's disappearance. She employed emissaries to prosecute the search in almost every part of the kingdom. Judging the metropolis to be the most likely place of concealment, she made application to the officers of police for assistance in her inquiries there. All was in vain. No trace of Lara was to be found. For a while de Courcy amused himself from day to day with the hope of hearing from her, a hope which his mother had not the courage to destroy. He calculated that she would reach the end of her journey on the 6th day after that on which she had left him. On the 7th she would certainly write. Therefore in 4 or 5 more he should undoubtedly hear from her. The expected day came and passed as others had done, without bringing news of Lara. Another and another came, and ended only in disappointment. De Courcy was miserable. He knew not how to account for a silence so adverse to the considerate kindness of Lara's character, except by supposing that illness made her unable to write. This idea gathering strength in his mind, he resolved to follow her immediately to Scotland, tracing her through the route which he knew she intended to take. Mrs. de Courcy in vain attempted to dissuade him from the prosecution of his design, and to soothe him with hopes which she knew too well would prove deceitful. He was resolute, and Mrs. de Courcy was at last obliged to prevent his fruitless journey by unfolding the truth. The utmost tenderness of caution was insufficient to prevent the effects of this blow on de Courcy's bodily frame. In a few hours strong fever seized him, and his wound, which had hitherto worn a favorable appearance, gave alarming symptoms of inflammation. 3 weeks did Mrs. de Courcy watch by his bedside in all the anguish of a mother's fears, forgetting, in her anxiety for his life, that he must for a time live only to sorrow. The balance long hung doubtful. At length, the strength of his constitution and his early habits of temperance prevailed. By slow degrees his health was restored, though his spirits were still oppressed by a dejection which long withstood every effort of reason and religion. To divert his sorrow, rather than in the hope of removing its cause, he left his home and wandered through the most unfrequented parts of England, making anxious, yet almost hopeless, inquiries for his lost treasure. Sometimes, misled by false intelligence, he was hurried from place to place in all the eagerness of expectation, but bitter disappointment closed the pursuit. and the companion of his relaxation, his encouragement in study, his pattern in virtue, the friend, the mistress, almost the wife, was lost beyond recall. While De Courcy was thus languishing on a sick-bed or wandering restless and miserable, Laura too was a wanderer, a prey to care more deep, more hopeless. The soft shades of twilight were stealing on as she cast a last look back towards Norwood, and were deepening fast as with a sigh, half pleasing, half melancholy, she surveyed the sheltering chestnut tree where she had once parted from De Courcy. As she approached her home, the stars coming forth poured their silent language into the ear of piety. Never deaf to this holy call, Laura dismissed her attendants that she might meditate alone. She proceeded slowly along till she came to the entrance of a woody lane, which branched off from the avenue. She stopped, half inclined to enter. A sensation of fear made her pause. The next moment the very consciousness of that sensation induced her to proceed. "This is mere childish superstition," said she, and entered the lane. She had taken only a few steps when she felt herself suddenly seized from behind, one person forcibly confining her arms while another prevented her cries. Vainly struggling against masculine strength, she was hurried rapidly forward, till, her breath failing, she could resist no farther. Her conductors, soon quitting the beaten path, dragged her on through a little wood that sheltered the lawn towards the east, till reaching a gap which appeared to have been purposely made in the park wall, Laura perceived a carriage in waiting. Again exerting the strength of desperation, she struggled wildly for freedom, but the unequal contest was soon closed. She was lifted into the carriage, one of the men took his place by her side, and they drove off with the speed of lightning. From the moment when she recovered recollection, Laura had not a doubt that she owed this outrage to Hargrave. She was convinced that his pretense of leaving the kingdom had been merely intended to throw her off her guard, and that he was now waiting, at no distant place, the success of his daring villainy. At this idea, a horrible dread seized her. She threw herself back in the carriage, and wept in despair. Her attendant, perceiving that she no longer struggled, with a coarse expression of pity, released her from his grasp, and taking the handkerchief from her mouth, told her she might cry as long as she pleased, for he knew it did a woman's heart good to cry. Laura now besought him to tell her whither she was going. "You'll know that by and by," said he. "Let me alone. I am going to sleep. Do you the same." The bare mention of his purpose revived Laura's hopes. "Surely," thought she, "while he sleeps, I may escape. In spite of this fearful speed, I may spring out, and if I could but gain a few steps, in this darkness I should be safe." Full of this project, she remained still as the dead, fearing by the slightest sound or motion to retard the sleep of her guard. At last his breathing announced that he was asleep, and Laura began, with trembling hands, to attempt her escape. The blinds were drawn up, and if she could let down that on one side of the carriage where she sat, she might without difficulty open the door. She tried to stir the blind. It refused to yield. She used her utmost force, but it remained firm. She ventured, cautious and trembling, to attempt that on the other side. It dropped, and Laura thought she was free. It only remained to open the door of the chaise and leap out. She tried it, but the door was immovable, and in despair she shrunk back. Again she started up, for it occurred to her that, though with more danger, she might escape by the window. She leaned out and placed her hands on top of the carriage, that, trusting to her arms for supporting her weight, she might extricate herself, and drop from thence into the road. Raising herself upon the edge of the step, she fixed her hands more firmly. She paused a moment to listen whether her guard were undisturbed. He still slept soundly, and resting her limbs upon the window frame, she prepared to complete her escape. A moment more and she had been free, when a horseman riding up pushed her fiercely back, upbraiding, with tremendous oaths, the carelessness of his companion. The fellow, rousing himself, retorted upon the wretched Laura the abuse of his comrade, swearing that, since he saw she was so cunning, he would keep better watch on her for the future. The desponding Laura endured his reproaches in silence. Finding herself thus doubly guarded, she resigned all hope of escaping by her own unaided exertions, and mingling silent prayers with her fearful anticipations, she strove to reanimate her trust that she should not be wholly forsaken. Sometimes her habitual confidence prevailed, and she felt assured that she should not be left a prey to the wicked. Yet the dreadful threats, the fiery passions of Hargrave rose to her recollection, and she again shuddered in despair. She suddenly remembered Jessie Wilson. Starting with an exclamation of horror and affright, she sought some weapon which might dispense her a death less terrible, and instinctively grasping her penknife, hid it in her bosom. The next moment she shrunk from her purpose, and doubted the lawfulness of such defense. "Will he dare his own life too?" thought she. "O heaven, in mercy spare me the necessity of sending a wretch to his great account, with all his crimes unrepented on his head, or pardon him and me?" She continued to commend herself to heaven, till her terrors by degrees subsided. She began again to feel the steady trust which is acquired by all who are habituated to a grateful consideration of the care which they experience, a trust that even the most adverse events shall terminate in their real advantage, that the rugged and slippery ways of this dark wilderness shall, at the dawn of everlasting day, be owned as the fittest to conduct us to the house of our Father. She began, too, to regain the confidence which strong minds naturally put in their own exertions. She resolved not to be wanting to herself, nor, by brooding over her terrors, to disable herself from taking advantage of any providential circumstance which might favor her escape. Morning at length began to dawn, but the blinds being closely drawn up, Laura could make no observations on the country through which she was passing. She remarked that the furious speed with which she had first been driven had slackened to a slow pace, and she judged that the wearied cattle could not proceed much further. She hoped that it would soon be necessary to stop, and that during the few minutes in which they halted to change horses, she might find means of appealing to the justice of her fellow creatures. "Surely," said she, "some heart will be open to me." After proceeding slowly for some time, the carriage stopped. Laura listened for the sounds of human voices, but all was silent. She heard the trampling of horses as if led close by the carriage. Someone was certainly near who had no interest in this base oppression. "Help! Oh, help me!" cried Laura. "I am cruelly and wrongfully detained. I have friends that will reward you. Heaven will reward you. Help me! For kind mercy, help me!" "Heyday!" cried the fellow in the carriage, with something between a grin and a stare. "Who is the girl speaking to? What? Did you imagine that we should be wise enough to bring you within holla of a whole yardful of stable boys and piping chambermaids? Reward indeed! Set your heart at rest, miss. We shall be rewarded without your friends, or heaven either." The carriage again proceeded with the same speed as at first, and Laura strove to support with composure this new blow to her hopes. Her companion, now producing a bottle of wine and some biscuits, advised her to share with him, and that she might not wilfully lavish her strength and spirits, she consented. Once more in the course of the day the travellers stopped to change horses, and Laura once more, though with feebler hopes, renewed her appeals to justice and mercy. No answer greeted her. Again she was hurried on her melancholy way. The day, as it advanced, seemed rough and gloomy. The wind swept in gusts through the trees, and the rain beat upon the carriage. The evening was drawing on when Laura remarked that the motion was changed. The chaise proceeded slowly over soft, uneven ground, and she guessed, with dismay, that it had quitted all frequented paths. In renewed alarm, she again besought her companion to tell her whither he meant to conduct her, and for what end she was thus cruelly forced from her home. "Why, how should I tell you what I do not know myself?" answered the man. "I shan't conduct you much farther, and a good riddance. As for the end, you'll see that when it comes." About an hour after quitting the road, the carriage stopped, and the man letting down the blind, Laura perceived through the dusk that they were on a barren moor. Waste and level, it seemed to spread before her, but the darkness prevented her from distinguishing its features or its boundaries. Suddenly, as the gust died away, she fancied she heard the roar of waters. She listened, but the wind swelled again, and she heard only its howlings over the heath. The horseman, who had rode away when the carriage stopped, now galloped back, and directed the postilion to proceed. They went on for a few hundred yards, and again they stopped. The roar of waters again burst on Laura's ear, now swelling in thunder, now sinking in a sullen murmur. She saw a light glimmer at a distance. It was tossed by the billows of the ocean. The door of the chaise was opened, and she was lifted from it. Gliding from the arms of the ruffian who held her, and clasping his knees, "Oh, if you have the heart of a man," she cried, "let me not be torn from my native land. Let me not be cast on the merciless deep. Think what it is to be an exile, friendless in a strange land, the sport, the prey of a pitiless enemy. Oh, if you have need of mercy, have mercy upon me." "Holla! Robert!" shouted the ruffian. "Take away this girl. She's enough to make a man play the fool and whimper." The other fellow now approaching, lifted Lara, more dead than alive, from the ground, and, wrapping her in a large cloak, bore her towards the beach. In a creek sheltered by rocks from the breakers lay a small boat. One man sat near the bow, roaring a hoarse sea-song. As the party approached, he rose, and pushing the boat ashore, received the half-lifeless Lara in his brawny arms, cursing her with strange oaths for having made him wait so long. Then, on his uttering a discordant yell, two of his companions appeared, and after exchanging with Lara's guards a murmuring account of the trouble they had undergone, pushed off from the land. The keel grated along the pebbles. The next moment it floated on the waves, and Lara, starting up, threw back the cloak from her face, and with strained eyes gazed on her parting native land, till all behind was darkness. A pang of anguish striking to her heart, she made once more a desperate effort to awaken pity. Stretching her clasped hands towards the man who sat near her, she cried, in the piercing voice of misery, "Oh, take pity on me! I am an orphan. I have heard that sailors have kindly hearts. Have pity, then. Land me on the wildest coast, and I will fall down and pray for you." The person to whom she spoke, having eyed her a moment in silence, coolly drew in his oar, and rising, wrapped her close in the cloak and laid her down in the bottom of the boat, advising her with an oath to keep snug or she would capsize them. In despair she renounced all further effort. Silent and motionless she lay, the cold spray dashing over her unheeded, till wet, chilled, and miserable, she was lifted on board a small brig which lay about half a mile from the shore. She was carried down to the cabin, which was more decent than is usual in vessels of that size. A clean-looking woman attended to undress her. Night clothes were in readiness for her, and every accommodation provided which her situation rendered possible. Everything served to convince her of the care and precaution with which this cruel scheme had been concerted, and to show her the depth of the snare into which she had fallen. She was laid in her narrow crib, ere it occurred to her that Hargrave might be near to watch his prey. Exhausted as she was, sleep fled at the thought. She listened for his voice, for his footstep, amid the unwonted discord that disturbed her ear. Daylight returned, and no sound reached her more terrible than that of the gale rattling in the cordage and dashing the waves against the vessel's side. Worn out with fatigue and suffering, she slept at length, and a midday sun glanced by fits through her grated window ere she awoke to a new sense of sorrow. She rose, and going upon deck, looked sadly back upon the way she had unconsciously passed. Behind, the blue mountains were sinking in the distance. On the left lay a coast unknown to her. Before her stretched the boundless deep, unvaried save by the whitening surge. Lara spent most of her time upon deck, the fresh air reviving her failing spirits. One male and one female attendant seemed appropriated to her, and served her with even officious assiduity. Hoping that some opportunity might occur of transmitting an account of her situation to England, she begged these obsequious attendants to supply her with writing materials, but was firmly, though respectfully, refused. The third morning came, and Lara looked in vain for any object to vary the immeasurable waste. The sun rose from one unbending line, and sunk again in naked majesty. She observed that the course of the vessel was in general directly west, and if she had before doubted, this circumstance would have convinced her of her destination. She once ventured to inquire whither the ship was bound, but was answered that she should know that when she reached the port. It was on the 4th of May that Lara began her ill-omened voyage. On the 12th of June, land. All ran to gaze with glad eyes on what seemed a low cloud, faintly descried on the verge of the horizon, all but Lara, who looked sadly forward, as to the land of exile, of degradation, of death. Day after day that dreaded land approached, till, by degrees, the boundless ocean was narrowed to a mighty river, and the unfrequent sail, almost too distant for mortal sight, was multiplied to a busy fleet, plying in every direction their cheerful labors. At length the city appeared in view, rising like an amphitheater, and flashing bright with a material unknown to European architecture. Laura inquired what town it was, and though refused all information, surmised that Quebec lay before her. Opposite the town, the ship hove to. A boat was launched, and Laura expected to be sent on shore. Nor did she unwillingly prepare to go. Surely, thought she, in this populous city someone will be found to listen to my tale, and wrest me from the arm of the oppressor. The boat, however, departed without her, carrying ashore the man who had hitherto attended her. After remaining on shore for several hours, the man returned, and the vessel again proceeded in her voyage. Laura now imagined that Montreal was her destined port, and again she strove to hope that, among numbers, she should find aid. A still, cloudy evening had succeeded to a sultry day when Laura observed an unusual bustle upon deck. It was growing dark when, as she leant over the rail to watch the fireflies that flashed like stars in the air, the captain approaching her told her that she must go ashore, and immediately lifted her into a boat which lay alongside. Her attendants and baggage were already there. The sailors had taken their oars, and, roaring to their companions a rough "good night," made towards the land. Instead, however, of gaining the nearest point, they rowed into what in the darkness seemed a creek. But Laura soon perceived that, having left the great river on which they had hitherto sailed, they were following the course of one of its tributary streams. The darkness prevented her from distinguishing objects on the banks, though now and then a light, glimmering from a casement, showed that the haunts of man were near. She could not even discern the countenances of the sailors, but she observed that he who seemed to direct the others spoke in a voice which was new to her ear. All night the rowers toiled up the stream. The day dawned, and Laura perceived that, passing an open, cultivated plain, she was pursuing her course towards woods impervious to the light. Dark and tangled they lowered over the stream, till they closed round, and every cheerful object was blotted from the scene. End of chapter 32. Recording by Scarbo.
Chapter 33 of Self-Control, a novel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Louise Poulsom. Self-Control, a novel by Mary Brunton. Chapter 33. The travellers had proceeded for some time, shaded by the overhanging woods. The distance lengthened by the dreary sameness of their way, when a wild halloo smote Laura's ear, and she perceived that 3 Indians stood at the water edge, making signs for the boat to land. To her unspeakable surprise, the sailors joyfully obeyed the signal. They ran their bark into a creek, to which the Indians pointed, and cheerfully busied themselves in discharging their cargo. Placed with her attendants on a little eminence, which rose above the swampy margin of the river, Laura took a fearful survey of the scene around her. Save where the sluggish stream opened to the day, her view was bounded to a few yards of marshy ground, rank with unwholesome vegetation. No track appeared to lead from this desolate spot. Between the gigantic pines, brushwood, and coarse grass spread in sad luxuriance, no trace was here of human footstep. All was dreary and forlorn, as the land which the first wanderers visited, unwilling. She had not long continued her melancholy survey when the 2 stoutest of the Indians approached, and one of them, after talking apart with her attendants, lifted her female servant in his arms and walked on. The other, making some uncouth gestures, prepared to raise Laura from the ground. She shrunk back alarmed, but the Indian, in broken French, assured her that he would not hurt her, and, pointing towards the woods, reminded her of the difficulty of passing them on foot. Her valet, too, represented the fatigue she must undergo if she refused the assistance of the Indian. But Laura, preferring a toilsome march to such a mode of conveyance, persevered in her refusal, and, bidding them lead the way, followed into the pathless wild. They continued their journey for several hours, no object meeting their sight that might mark the stages of their way. No work of man appeared, not even the faintest trace that ever man had toiled through this wilderness. Yet Laura perceived that the Indians proceeded without hesitation. The position of the grass, the appearance of the leaves, gave indications sufficient to guide them in their route. One of them carried a bag of provisions, and, having reached a spot where the ground was firm and dry, he invited Laura to sit down and take some refreshment. Faint with fatigue, Laura thankfully acceded. Scarcely, however, had she seated herself on the grass ere her attention was drawn by a slight, though unusual noise, and she was told that it was caused by a rattlesnake. At this intelligence, her maid screaming started up, and was going to dart forward into the wood. The Indians beheld her terror with silent contempt, while Laura calmly detained her with gentle force. "Stay, Mary," said she. "If you tread on the animal, you are gone. If we are quiet, we may probably see and avoid it." The influence which Laura always acquired over those with whom she lived prevailed over Mary's dread, and in a few moments the serpent was seen by one of the Indians, who killed it with a single blow. Their hasty meal ended, the party proceeded on their way, but they had not gone far ere Laura, worn out with toil and sorrow, sunk upon the ground. She now had no choice, and the Indian, lifting her with the same ease as she would have done an infant, went on with more speed than before. Towards the close of the day, the wood suddenly opened into a small field, surrounded by them on every side, which appeared to have been itself imperfectly redeemed from the same state of waste luxuriance. In the centre stood a house, or rather a cabin, rudely constructed of the material which nature so lavishly supplied. Around it, a small patch, enclosed by a palisade, bore marks of forsaken cultivation. Beyond this enclosure, logs of prodigious size lay scattered through the field, and the roots which had not been cleared from the ground were again shooting luxuriantly. With a faint sensation of gladness, Laura beheld traces of humankind. Yet no living creature appeared. Here reigned primeval stillness. The winds had died away. A sultry calm filled the air. The woods were motionless. The birds were silent. All was fixed, as in death, save where a dull stream stole under the tall canes that deformed its margin. Mary's exclamations of grief and surprise first informed Laura that she had reached her home. To Laura, the dreariness of the scene was of small concern. No outward circumstances could add to the horrors with which her fears were familiar. While her attendant bewailed aloud that ever thirst of gain had lured her from happy England, Laura was inwardly striving to revive the hope that sudden death might snatch her from the grasp of the oppressor, and renewing her oft-repeated prayer, "Oh, that thou wouldst hide me in the grave!" But no selfish sorrow could make her regardless of the woes of others. "Courage, Mary," said she with a foreboding smile. "We shall soon be released, and both, I hope, find shelter in our father's house." The cabin was divided into 3 apartments, each entering from the other. To the innermost Laura was conducted, and she saw that it had been arranged for her. The window was secured with iron. The furniture, unlike that of the other rooms, was new and not inelegant. Laura looked round to observe whether any trace of Hargrave's presence was visible. None appeared. She examined every recess and corner of her new abode, as one who fears the lurking assassin. She ascertained that Hargrave was not its inmate, and thanked heaven for the prospect of one night of peace. It was in vain, however, that she tried to discover how long this reprieve might last. The servants either could not or would not give her any information. She was too well acquainted with the character of her oppressor to hope that he would long delay his coming. "Tomorrow, perhaps," thought she, and the cold shivering came over her, which now ever followed her anticipation of the future. "Yet why do I despair?" said she. "Is any time too short, or any means too feeble for the power, for the wisdom in which I trust? But since the hour of trial may be so near, let me not waste the time which should prepare for it, prepare to cast off this poor clog of earth, and rise beyond its sorrows and its stains." Laura's bodily frame, however, could not long keep pace with the efforts of her mind, for her health and strength were failing under the continued influence of grief and fear. The form, once rounded in fair proportion, was wasted to shadow. The once graceful neck bent mournfully forward, the lily arms hung down in listless melancholy. The cheek, once of form inimitable, was sunk and hollow now. The colour, once quick to tell the modest thought, was fixed in the paleness of the dead, and death was ever present to her thoughts, sole point to which her hope turned steadily. One only desire lingered on earth. She wished that some friend should pity her hard fate and know that the victim had shrunk from it, though in vain. Intending to leave behind her some attestation of her innocence, she besought Mary to procure for her the means of writing. "Why should you fear to trust me?" said she. "To whom upon earth can my complaint reach now? You may see all I write, Mary, and perhaps when I am gone, you yourself convey it, my friend. Your master will not prevent you then, for he will have pity on me, and wish that he had not dealt with me so hardly." The irresistible sweetness of Laura had won the heart of her attendant, and Mary promised that she would endeavour to gratify her. She said that the writing materials were kept carefully locked up by Robert, the manservant, that his master's orders on the subject had been peremptory, that she was sure he would not venture to disobey while there remained a possibility of conveying intelligence from the place of their confinement, that 2 of the Indians were to depart on the following day, and after they were gone, no means of access to the habitable world remaining. Robert might possibly relax his strictness and permit Laura to amuse herself with writing. Mary's words awakened in Laura's mind an idea that all was not yet lost. The Indians were suspected of favouring her. They might then bear her appeal to human pity, to human justice. If she could find a means to speak with them, she would plead so earnestly that even savages would be moved to mercy. At these thoughts a ray of hope once more kindled in her breast. It was the last. All day she watched for an opportunity to address one of the Indians. In vain. Robert guarded her with such relentless fidelity that she found it impossible to effect her purpose. The Indians departed. Mary performed her promise, and the unfortunate Laura wrote the following letter, which was afterwards, with Hargrave's permission, conveyed to Mrs. Douglas. "From this dreary land of exile, to whom shall I address myself save to you, mine own friend, and my father's friend? Where tell my sad fate save to you, who first taught me that hope lives beyond it? And let it comfort your kind heart to know that while you are shedding tears over this last memorial of your Laura, I shall be rejoicing in the full consummation of that hope. There is indeed another friend, one to whom my last earthly thoughts are due, but I cannot tell him that she, who was almost the wife of his bosom, is gone down to a dishonoured grave. I have not had time to soften my sad tale to him, nor to study words of comfort, for the moments are precious with me now. A few, a very few, are all that remain for preparation. I must not rob them of their awful right. Tell him my story as he is able to bear it. Tell him my innocence, and he will believe it, for he knew my very soul. But I must hasten lest the destroyer come, ere in these lines I close my connection with this world of trial." She then proceeded to give a simple narrative of her wrongs. She expressed no bitterness against the author of them. She spoke them as a misguided being, and pitied the anguish which he was preparing for himself. "Tell Mr. de Courcy," she proceeded, "that I charge him by all the love he bears me to forgive my enemy. Even from the heart forgive him. Let him do more. Let him pray for him, and if they meet, admonish him. It may be that his heart will soften when he remembers me." The remainder of the letter was written at intervals. Laura spent her time chiefly in acts of devotion, of self-examination and repentance. It was only when exhausted nature could no longer follow these exercises of the soul that she returned to add another line to her picture of wretchedness. "The saints who resisted unto blood striving against sin, who gave up their lives in defence of the truth, looked forward to the hour of their departure rejoicing. But I must go to the grave laden with shame and sorrow. My soul is weary of life, and yet I must fear to die. Yet let my enemy a little while delay his coming, and my death also will be joyful. Let him stay only a few days, and I shall be deaf to the voice of the oppressor. I am wasting fast away. If he haste not to catch the shadow, it will be gone." The people whom he has appointed to guard his poor prisoner no longer watch me as they once did. It is useless now. A few short steps, and my feeble limbs bend to the earth, reminding me whither I am hastening. When I am gone, Mary, will you carry the ringlets which you were wont to twine round your finger? Send one of them to her who should have been my sister, but give not any to mine own Montague, for he will pine over them when he might be happy in some new connection. Yet tell him that I loved him to the end. I believe he sometimes doubted of my love. But tell him that I bore him a firm affection. Passion is unfit for the things of this world. I have a letter from my enemy. In 2 days more, I have a knife concealed in my bosom. All night it is hidden beneath my pillow, and when my weary eyes close for a moment, I grasp it, and the chill touch rouses me again. Mine own dear friend, did you think when you first taught me to join my little hands in prayer that these hands should be stained with murder? Is it a crime to die when I can no longer live with innocence, when there is no escape but the grave? Is it forbidden to hide me there? My mind grows feeble now. I cannot discern between good and evil. Why is my soul bowed down to the dust, as if the fountain of compassion were sealed? I will yet trust him who is the helper of those who have no help in man. It might be that he will melt the heart of my enemy, and move him to let me die in peace, or perhaps even the sight of my persecutor may be permitted to burst the rending heart, to scare the trembling spirit from its prison. This day is my last, and it is closing now. The silence of midnight is around me. Ere it again return, a deeper night shall close for me, and the weary pilgrim shall sink to rest. It is time that I loosen me from the earth. I will not give my last hours to this land of shadows. Then fare you well, mine own dear friend. You first pointed my wishes to that better world where I shall not long wait your coming. And fare thee well, mine own Montague. Take comfort that I was not fit to linger here, for I had desires that earth could not satisfy, and thirstings after a perfection which this weak heart could not attain. Farewell. I will look back no more. Hargrave's letter to Laura. My dearest Laura, the tantalizing business, which has so long thwarted my wishes, will still detain me for 2 days. Your gentle mind cannot imagine what this delay costs me. My only recompense is that it affords me an opportunity of showing you somewhat of that consideration with which I could always wish to treat you. I willingly forgo the advantage of surprise for the sake of allowing you to exercise that decision which you are so well qualified to use discreetly. You know, Laura, how I have doted on you. For near 4 long years you have been the desire of my soul, and now that my happy daring has placed me within reach of my utmost wishes, I would fain attain them without distress to you. This is no time for concealment, and you must pardon me if I am explicit with you. I have known the disposition of Lady Pelham's fortune from the hour when it was made. You know that with all my faults I am not sordid, but circumstances have rendered money necessary to me, except in the event of Lord Lingcourt's death. I cannot return to England otherwise than as your husband. I will own too, dearest Laura, that after all I have done, and all that I may be compelled to do, I dare not trust for pardon to your pity alone. I must interest your duty in my cause. Consider your situation, then, my beloved, and spare me the pain of distressing you. I have watched you, implored you, pined for you. I have borne your coldness, your scorn. I have ventured my life to obtain you. Judge whether I be of temper to be balked of my reward. You must be mine, bewitching Laura. No cool, insulting, plausible pretender can cheat me of you now. Trackless woods divide you from all humankind. I have provided against the possibility of tracing your retreat. It rests with you, then, to choose whether you will bless my love with a willing and honourable reward, or force me to extort the power of bestowing obligation. My charming Laura, for now indeed I may call you mine. Pardon, in consideration of its sincerity, the abrupt language I am compelled to hold. One thing more. In 3 weeks I must return hither. The engagement of your British attendants expires before that time. I cannot for a moment allow myself to suppose that you will prefer a hopeless solitary exile to the reparation which I shall even then be so anxious to make, to the endearments of a fond husband, of an impassioned lover, to the envy and homage of an admiring world. Suffer me rather, dear lovely girl, to exult in the hope that you will receive, without reluctance, the man to whom fate assigns you, and that you will recall somewhat of the tenderness you once confessed for your own ever-devoted Villiers Hargrave. Laura's answer, sent with the foregoing to Mrs. Douglas. I thought my spirit had been broken, crushed, never more to rise. Must the glow of indignation mingle with the damps of death? But I will not upbraid you. The language of forgiveness best befits me now. The measure of your injuries to me is almost full, yet those which you have heaped upon yourself are yet more deep and irreparable. My blasted fame, my life cut off in its prime, even the horrible dread that has overwhelmed me, are nothing to the pangs of hopeless remorse, the unaccepted struggle for repentance. Yet a little while, and this darkness shall burst into light ineffable. Yet a little while, and this sorrow shall be as the remembrance of a troubled dream. But you, O Hargrave, have pity on yourself. It was not to warn, it was to plead with you, that I won on my knees the consent of your messenger to bear my reply. I will strive to hope, for you were not always pitiless. I have seen you feel for the sufferings of a stranger. And have you no mercy for me? Alas, in those pitying tears I saw you shed began this long train of evil. For then began my base idolatry, and justly have you been made the instrument of my punishment. My mind wanders. I am weaker than a child. O Hargrave, if you have human pity, let the feeble spark expire in peace. Here, where no Christian footstep shall hallow the turf that covers me, nor the song of Christian praise rise near my grave. Here let me lay down and die, and I will bless you that I die in peace. I dare not spend my parting breath in uttering unholy vows, nor die a voluntary partner in your crimes. Nor would I, had my life been prolonged, have joined to pollution this dust which, perishable as it is, must rise to immortality, which, vile as it is, more vile as soon it may be, shall yet put on incorruption. Why then should you come hither? Will it please you to see this poor piece of clay, for which you have ventured your soul, faded to an object of horror, cast uncoffined into the earth, robbed of the decencies which Christians pay even to the worst of sinners? When you look upon my stiffened corpse, will you then triumph in the security of your possession? Will you again exult in hope, when you turn from my grave and say, Here lies the wretch whom I have undone? Come not, I charge you, if you would escape the anguish of the murderer. When did the evil of your deeds stop within your first intention? Do not amuse your conscience with the dream of reparation. I am fallen indeed, ere you dare insult me with the thought. Will you wed the dead, or could I outlive your injuries? Think you that I would sink so low as to repay them with myself? Reward with vows of love a crime more black than murder? Though my name, already degraded through you, must no more claim alliance with the good and worthy, think you that I would bind myself before heaven to a wretch who owed his very life to my undeserved mercy? Inhuman! Your insults have roused the failing spirit, yet I must quell these last stirrings of nature. Instant, full, and free must be my forgiveness, for such is the forgiveness which I shall soon require. Perhaps, as now you seem to think me fit for any baseness, you will suppose my forebodings a poor deceit to win you from your purpose. See then if you can trace in these unsteady lines the vigour of health. Ask him who bears them to you, how looks now the face which you call lovely? Ask him if the hand which gave this letter looks soft and graceful now. I love to gaze upon it. It bids me hope, for it is like no living thing. Inquire minutely. Ask if there remains one charm to lure you on to farther guilt, and if death has already seized on all. If he has spared nothing to desire, will you yet hurry him on his prey? You have made life a burden too heavy for the weary frame. Will you make death too dreadful to be endured? Will you add to its horrors till nature and religion shrink from it in agony? I cannot plead with you as I would. My strength fails. My eyes are dim with weeping. Oh, grant that this farewell may be the last, that we may meet no more till I welcome you with the joy which angels feel over the sinner that repenteth. The whole of the night preceding Hargrave's arrival was passed by Laura in acts of devotion. In her life, blameless as it had appeared to others, she saw so much ground for condemnation that, had her hopes rested upon her own merit, they would have vanished like the sunshine of a winter storm. Their support was more mighty, and they remained unshaken. The raptures of faith beamed on her soul. By degrees they triumphed over every fear, and the first sound that awoke the morning was her voice raised in a trembling hymn of praise. Her countenance elevated as in hope, her eyes cast upwards, her hands clasped, her lips half open in the unfinished adoration. Her face brightened with a smile, the dawn of eternal day. She was found by her attendant. Awestruck, the woman paused, and, at a reverent distance, gazed upon the seraph. But her entrance had called back the unwilling spirit from its flight, and Laura, once more a feeble child of earth, faintly inquired whether her enemy were at hand. Mary answered that her master was not expected to arrive before the evening, and entreated that Laura would try to recruit her spirits and accept of some refreshment. Laura made no opposition. She unconsciously swallowed what was placed before her, unwittingly suffered her attendant to lead her abroad, nor once heeded aught that was done to her, nor aught that passed before her eyes, till her exhausted limbs found rest upon the trunk of a tree, which lay mouldering near the spot where its root was sending forth a luxuriant thicket. The breath of the morning blew chill on the wasted form of Laura, while it somewhat revived her to strength and recollection. Her attendant, seeing her shiver in the breeze, compassionately wrapped her more closely in her cloak, and ran to seek a warmer covering. "She feels for my bodily wants," said Laura. "Will she have no pity for the sufferings of the soul? Yet what relief can she afford? What help is there for me in man? O be thou my help, who art the guard of the defenceless, thou who canst shield in every danger, thou who canst guide in every difficulty." Her eye rested, as it fell upon a track as of recent footsteps. They had brushed away the dew, and the rank grass had not yet risen from their pressure. The unwonted trace of man's presence arrested her attention, and her mind, exhausted by suffering, and sharing the weakness of its frail abode, admitted the superstitious thought that these marks afforded a providential indication for her guidance. Transient animation kindling her frame, she followed the track as it wound round a thicket of poplar. Then, suddenly recollecting herself, she became conscious of the delusion, and shed a tear over her mental decay. She was about to return when she perceived that she was near the bank of the river. Its dark flood was stealing noiseless by, and Laura, looking on it, breathed the oft-repeated wish that she could seek rest beneath its waves. Again she moved feebly forward. She reached the brink of the stream, and stood unconsciously following its course with her eye, when a light wind stirring the canes that grew down to the water's edge, she beheld close by her an Indian canoe. With the suddenness that mocks the speed of light, hope flashed on the darkened soul, and, stretching her arms in wild ecstasy, "Help! Help!" cried Laura, and sprung towards the boat. A feeble echo from the further shore alone returned the cry. Again she called. No human voice replied, but delirious transport lent vigour to her frame. She sprung into the bark. She pressed the slender oar against the bank. The light vessel yielded to her touch. It floated. The stream bore it along. The woods closed around her prison. "Thou hast delivered me," she cried, and sunk senseless. A meridian sun beat on her uncovered head ere Laura began to revive. Recollection stole upon her like the remembrance of a feverish dream, as one who, waking from a fearful vision, still trembles in his joy. She scarcely dared to hope that the dread hour was past, till, raising her eyes, she saw the dark woods bend over her, and steal slowly away as the canoe glided on with the tide. The raptures of fallen man own their alliance with pain by seeking the same expression. Joy and gratitude, too big for utterance, long poured themselves forth in tears. At length, returning composure permitted the language of ecstasy. It was breathed in the accents of devotion, and the lone world echoed to a song of deliverance. The saintly strain rose unmixed with other sound. No breeze moaned through the impervious woods. No ripple broke the stream. The dark shadows trembled for a moment in its bosom, as the little bark stole by, and then reposed again. No trace appeared of human presence. The fox, peeping from the brushwood, the wild duck sailing stately in the stream, saw the unwanted stranger without alarm, untaught as yet to flee from the destroyer. The day declined, and Laura, with the joy of her escape, began to mingle a wish that ere the darkness closed around her, she might find shelter near her fellow beings. She was not ignorant of the dangers of her voyage. She knew that the navigation of the river was interrupted by rapids. A cataract which broke its course had been purposely described in her hearing. She examined her frail vessel and trembled, for life was again become precious, and feeble seemed her defence against the torrent. The canoe, which could not have contained more than 2 persons, was constructed of a slender frame of wood covered with the bark of the birch. It yielded to the slightest motion, and caution was necessary to poise it even in the light form of Laura. Slowly it floated down the lingering tide, and when a pine of larger size or form, more fantastic than its fellows, enabled her to measure her progress, she thought that through wilds less impassable her own limbs would have borne her more swiftly. In vain behind each tangled point did her fancy picture the haunt of man. Vainly amid the mists of eve did she trace the smoke of sheltered cottages. In vain, at every winding of the stream, she sent forward a longing eye in search of human dwelling. The narrow view was bounded by the dark wilderness, repeating ever the same picture of dreary repose. The sun went down, the shadows of evening fell, not such as in her happy native land blend softly with the last radiance of day, but black and heavy, harshly contrasting with the light of a naked sky reflected from the waters, where they spread beyond the gloom of impending woods. Dark and more dark the night came on, solemn even amid the peopled land. In this vast solitude it became more awful. Ignorant how near the place of danger might be, fearing to pursue darkling her perilous way, Laura tried to steer her light bark to the shore, intending to moor it, to find in it a rude resting place, and in the morning to pursue her way. Laboriously she toiled, and at length reached the bank in safety. But in vain she tried to draw her little vessel to land. Its weight resisted her strength. Dreading that it should slip from her grasp and leave her without means of escape, she re-entered it, and again glided on her dismal voyage. She had found in the canoe a little coarse bread made of Indian corn, and this, with the water from the river, formed her own sustenance. Her frame, worn out with previous suffering, awe and fear, at last yielded to fatigue, and the weary wanderer sunk to sleep. It was late on the morning of a cloudy day, when a low murmuring sound, stealing on the silence, awoke Laura from the rest of innocence. She listened. The murmur seemed to swell on her ear. She looked up. The dark woods still bent over her, but they no longer touched the margin of the stream. They stretched their giant arms from the summit of a precipice. Their image was no more reflected unbroken. The grey rocks which supported them but lent their colours to the rippling water. The wild duck, no longer tempting the stream, flew screaming over its bed. Each object hastened on with fearful rapidity, and the murmuring sound was now a deafening roar. Fear supplying superhuman strength, Laura strove to turn the course of her vessel. She used the force of desperation, half hoping that the struggle might save her, half fearing to note her dreadful progress. She toiled on till the oar was torn from her powerless grasp, and hurried along with the tide. The fear of death alone had not the power to overwhelm the soul of Laura. Somewhat might yet be done perhaps to avert her fate, at least to prepare for it. Feeble as was the chance of life, it was not to be rejected. Fixing her cloak more firmly around her, Laura was bound to the slender frame of the canoe. Then, commanding herself to heaven with the fervour of a last prayer, she, in the dread stillness, awaited her doom. With terrible speed the vessel hurried on. It was whirled around by the torrent, tossed fearfully, and hurried on again. It shot over a smoothness more dreadful than the eddying whirl. It rose upon its prow. Laura clung to it in the convulsion of terror. A moment she trembled on the giddy verge. The next, all was darkness. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of Self-Control, a Novel. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Diane Castillo. Self-Control, a Novel by Mary Brunton. Chapter 34. When Laura was restored to recollection, she found herself in a plain, decent apartment. Several persons of her own sex were humanely busied in attending her. Her mind retaining a confused remembrance of the past, she inquired where she was, and how she had been brought thither. An elderly woman of a prepossessing appearance answered with almost maternal kindness that she was among friends all anxious for her safety, begged that she would try to sleep, and promised to satisfy her curiosity when she should be more able to converse. This benevolent person, whose name was Falkland, then administered a restorative to her patient, and Laura, uttering almost incoherent expressions of gratitude, composed herself to rest. Awakening refreshed and collected, she found Mrs. Falkland and one of her daughters still watching by her bedside. Laura again repeated her questions, and Mrs. Falkland fulfilled her promise by relating that her husband, who was a farmer, having been employed with his 2 sons in a field which overlooked the river, had observed the canoe approach the fall, that seeing it too late to prevent the accident, they had hurried down to the bed of the stream below the cataract in hopes of intercepting the boat at its reappearance. That being accustomed to float wood down the torrent, they knew precisely the spot where their assistance was most likely to prove effectual. That the canoe, though covered with foam for a moment, had instantly risen again, and that Mr. Falkland and his sons had, not without danger, succeeded in drawing it to land. She then, in her turn, inquired by what accident Laura had been exposed to such a perilous adventure, expressing her wonder at the direction of her voyage, since Falkland Farm was the last inhabited spot in that district. Laura, mingling her natural reserve with a desire to satisfy her kind hostess, answered that she had been torn from her friends by an inhuman enemy, and that her perilous voyage was the least effect of his barbarity. "Do you know," said Mrs. Falkland, somewhat mistaking her meaning, "that to his cruelty you partly owe your life? For had he not bound you to the canoe, you must have sunk while the boat floated on." Laura heard with a faint smile the effect of her self-possession, but considering it as a call to pious gratitude rather than a theme of self-applause, she forbore to offer any claim to praise, and suffered the subject to drop without further explanation. Having remained for 2 days with this hospitable family, Laura expressed a wish to depart. She communicated to Mr. Falkland her desire of returning immediately to Europe, and begged that he would introduce her to some asylum where she might wait the departure of a vessel for Britain. She expressed her willingness to content herself with the poorest accommodation, confessing that she had not the means of purchasing any of a higher class. All the wealth, indeed, which she could command consisted in a few guineas which she had accidentally had about her when she was taken from her home, and a ring which Mrs. De Courcy had given her at parting. Her hosts kindly urged her to remain with them till they should ascertain that a vessel was immediately to sail, in which she might secure her passage, assuring her that a week scarcely ever elapsed without some departure for her native country. Finding, however, that she was anxious to be gone, Mr. Falkland himself accompanied her to Quebec. They traveled by land. The country at first bore the characters of a half-redeemed wilderness. The road wound at times through dreary woods, at others through fields where noxious variety of hue bespoke imperfect cultivation. At last it approached the great river, and Laura gazed with delight on the ever-changing, rich, and beautiful scenes which were presented to her view. Scenes which she had passed unheeded when grief and fear veiled every prospect in gloom. One of the nuns in the Hotel Dieu was the sister of Mrs. Falkland, and to her care Mr. Falkland intended to commit his charge. But before he had been an hour in the town, he received information that a ship was weighing anchor for the Clyde, and Laura eagerly embraced the opportunity. The captain, being informed by Mr. Falkland that she could not advance the price of her passage, at first hesitated to receive her. But when, with the irresistible candor and majesty that shone in all her looks and words, she assured him of his reward, when she spoke to him in the accents of his native land, the Scotsman's heart melted, and having satisfied himself that she was a Highlander, he closed the bargain by swearing that he was sure he might trust her. With tears in her eyes, Laura took leave of her benevolent host. Yet her heart bounded with joy as she saw the vessel cleaving the tide, and each object in the dreaded land of exile swiftly retiring from her view. In a few days that dreaded land disappeared. In a few more the mountains of Cape Breton sunk behind the wave. The brisk gales of autumn wafted the vessel cheerfully on her way, and often did Laura compute her progress. In a clear, frosty morning, towards the end of September, she heard once more the cry of "Land!" now music to her ear. Now, with a beating breast, she ran to gaze upon a ridge of mountains indenting the disk of the rising sun. But the tears of rapture dimmed her eyes when every voice at once shouted, "Scotland!" All day Laura remained on deck, oft measuring, with the light splinter, the vessel's course through the deep. The winds favored not her impatience. Towards evening they died away, and scarcely did the vessel steal along the liquid mirror. Another and another morning came, and Laura's ear was blessed with the first sounds of her native land. The tolling of a bell was borne along the water, now swelling loud and now falling softly away. The humble village was seen on the shore, and Laura could distinguish the gay coloring of her country woman's Sunday attire, the scarlet plaid transmitted from generation to generation, pinned decently over the plain coif, the bright blue gown, the trophy of more recent housewifery. To her every form in the well-known garb seemed the form of a friend. The blue mountains in the distance, the scattered woods, the fields yellow with the harvest, the river sparkling in the sun, seemed, to the wanderer returning from the land of strangers, fairer than the gardens of paradise. Land of my affections! When I forget thee, may my right hand forget her cunning. Blessed be thou among nations. Long may thy wanderers return to thee rejoicing, and their hearts throb with honest pride when they own themselves thy children. The vessel at last cast anchor, and all was cheerful bustle. Every one eager to hurry ashore. Some hastened to launch the boat, some ran below to seek out the little offerings of love which they had brought for their friends. Never had Laura heard sound so animating as the cry of "All ready!" followed by the light short stroke of the oar that sent her swiftly forward. Many a wistful glance did the rowers turn. "There's mother on the pier head!" cried one. "I see Annie and the bairns!" cried another, and the oar was plied more swiftly. They landed. The shout of joy and the whisper of affection were exchanged on every side. Laura stood back from the tumult, breathing a silent thanksgiving on behalf of herself and her companions. "Poor lassie," said the captain, approaching her, "is there naebody to welcome thee? Come, I'm going up to Glasgow the night to see my wife and the owners, and if ye like to gang with me, ye'll be safe far on your way to your friends." Laura thankfully accepted the proposal, and the fly-boat being just about to sail up the river, she placed in it the little packet of necessaries which she had collected at Quebec, and accompanied the good-natured sailor to his home. She was kindly received by his wife and daughter, and furnished with the best accommodations they could command. The next morning she gave the captain a draft for the price of her passage, and, producing her purse and Mrs. De Courcy's ring, offered them as further security, saying that she was now in her own country. A few shillings would support her till she reached her friends, since she might travel to Perthshire on foot. The sailor, however, positively refused to accept of anything more than the draft, swearing that if he were deceived in Laura, he would never trust woman again. He then, at her desire, procured her a seat in the stage-coach, and once more she proceeded on her journey. At a small village a few miles from Perth she desired to be set down. A by-road led from the village to Mr. Douglas's parish. The distance was said to be only 7 miles, and Laura, forgetting the latitude allowed to Scottish measurement, thought she might easily reach the parsonage before nightfall. Leaving her little parcel at the village, she hastened forward, now pausing a moment as some well-known peak or cliff met her eye, now bounding on with the light step of joy. She pictured the welcome of affection already she saw in the mild countenance of her early friend. Already she felt the embrace of love. Darkness surprised her when she had yet much of her journey to perform, and had shrouded every object ere she reached the well-known gate, and saw across the narrow lawn the lights streaming from the window. She stopped, fear stealing on her joy. In 5 months, what changes might not have happened? Her friend, her mother, might be ill, might be dead. So must weak men mitigate with the prospect of evil the transports which belong not to his inheritance. She again proceeded. She entered the hall. The parlor door was open. A group of cheerful faces appeared, ruddy with youth and health. But Laura's eye rested on one of more mature, more interesting grace, one shaded with untimely silver, and lighted up with milder fires. She remained motionless, fearing to surprise her friend by too suddenly appearing, till one of the girls, observing her, exclaimed, in a transport of joy, "Laura! Mamma! Laura!" Mrs. Douglas sprung from her seat, and the welcome of affection, the embrace of love, were reality. The first burst of gladness was succeeded by the solicitous inquiry, by the interesting narrative, and Laura beguiled her friend of many tears by the story of her sad voyage, her hopeless captivity, her perilous escape. Tears, too, of real bitterness rose to her eyes at the thought that, although she had escaped from the cruelty of her oppressor, yet its consequences must be lasting as her life, and that she was now pouring her story perhaps into the only ear that would be open to her protestations of innocence. But she would not cloud the hour of joy by calling the attention of her friend to the shade that rested on her prospects, nor diminish her own gratitude for deliverance from more real misfortune by anticipating the scorns of the world. She uttered not the faintest foreboding of evil, but continued with serene cheerfulness to charm as she was wont to do, till at a late hour the friendly party separated for the night. Weary as she was, Laura could not rest. She had a task to perform, too painful to be thought of with indifference. It was necessary to write to De Courcy, and to damp all the pleasure which a knowledge of her safety would convey, by retracting engagements which had been made when her alliance inferred no dishonor. She well knew that De Courcy himself, convinced of her innocence, would spurn the idea of forsaking her in misfortune, of giving, by his desertion, a sanctuary to calumny. And should she take advantage of his honor and his love to fix in his heart the incurable anguish of following to the wife of his bosom the glance of suspicion or of scorn, the world's neglect was trivial in her estimation. Even its reproach might be endured by one who could appeal from its sentence to a higher tribunal. But what should ease the heart whose best affections were turned to poison by domestic shame? The heart jealous of the honor which it could not defend, bleeding at the stab from which it dared not recoil? Laura had already taken her resolution, and the next day saw it effected. She wrote to De Courcy, detailing minutely every event that had befallen her from the hour of their separation till her landing in Britain. There her narrative closed. She told not in what spot the wanderer had found rest. She did not even intimate in what part of the island she had disembarked, lest it should furnish a clue to her present retreat. Nor did she, by expressions of tenderness and regret, aggravate the pain which she was compelled to inflict. In words like these she proceeded: "And now, my respected friend, I imagine you are pausing to offer a thanksgiving for yourself and for me. Let it not damp your just gratitude that somewhat of evil is permitted to mingle with this signal deliverance. Let not my escape from misfortune, the most dreadful, be forgotten, even though the world should refuse to believe in that escape. For thus it must be. Known to have been in the power of that bad man, will the harsh judging world believe me innocent? Will it be believed that he ventured to cast his very life upon my mercy by dragging me unwilling from my home? So long the sport of his ungoverned passions, will it be believed that I have not even seen him? I know it will be difficult to convince you that an unjust sentence can be pronounced against me. Certain yourself of the truth of my story, you imagine that it will find easy credence with others. But even if we could change the nature of man and teach strangers to judge with the candor of friendship, who shall furnish them with the materials for judging? Not he who, in corroborating my tale, must publish his own disgrace. Not the weak Laura, who, by a constitutional defect, shrinks even from the eye where she cannot read distrust. Consider all this, and you will at once perceive the reasons which induce me to conceal myself from you for a time. Engagements formed under circumstances now so materially changed I cannot consider as binding. You, I fear, may think otherwise, and be hurried on by your generous nature to tempt a fate which that very turn of mind would render insupportable. My own part in this fate I think I can bear. The share which would fall upon you, I own, would crush me to the dust. My spirits are not yet what they have been. I am weary of struggling with a perverse heart, ever leading me aside from duty. I will not lend it arms by exposing myself to entreaties and arguments to which I cannot yield without betraying my best friend to anguish unpitied and hopeless, anguish which would bear with double pressure on myself. A stain is fallen on my good name, and the glory has departed from me. Be it so. He who doth all things well hath chosen my lot, and his choice shall be mine. I trust I shall be enabled to act as becomes one who is degraded in the public eye. I have sometimes shrunk from the approbation of the world, that little circle, I mean, which we are apt to call the world. Now I will hide me from its censure, and shall find in the duties which peculiarly belong to the fallen, the duties of humility, of charity, and of devotion, enough to make life still no unpleasing pilgrimage. A good name has been justly likened to a jewel, precious, not necessary. But if you, my dear friend, covet fame for me, look forward to the time when an assembled universe shall behold my acquittal, when a judge before whom the assembled universe is as nothing shall proclaim me for his own. This letter Laura accompanied with another, in which she begged Mrs. De Courcy's assistance in reconciling her son to the change in his prospects. Both were enclosed by Mr. Douglas to a friend in London, who was directed to forward them by post, thus avoiding any trace of the quarter from whence they came. Her lot thus chosen, Laura began to make arrangements for entering on a mode of life befitting her situation. Fearing that the shaft of slander should glance aside from herself to the friends who still clung to her, she steadily resisted Mrs. Douglas's warm invitations to make the parsonage her home. Her father's little farm at Glenelbert had been annexed to one of a larger size. The cottage remained untenanted, and thither Laura determined to retire. Her fortune, however far from affluent, she thought would suffice to support the humble establishment which she meant to retain. One servant was sufficient for her who had been accustomed to make few claims on the assistance of others. To obviate the impropriety of living alone while yet extreme youth made even nominal protection valuable. She invited an elderly widow lady, poor but respectable, to preside in her household. In necessary preparations for her removal to Glenelbert, in affectionate assiduities to the friends with whom she resided, in compensating to her own poor for her long, though involuntary, neglect of their claims. Laura sought a refuge from painful reflection, and if a sigh arose at the review of her altered prospects, she called to mind her deliverance, and regret was exchanged for thankfulness. The vain might have bewailed a seclusion thus untimely, thus permanent. The worldly minded might have mourned the forfeiture of earthly prosperity. Any spirit unsupported by religion must have sunk under unmerited disgrace, embittered by keen sense of shame and constitutional timidity. Laura was a Christian, and she could even at times rejoice that the spirit of vanity was mortified, the temptations of the world withdrawn. Even where the blow was more painful, she humbly believed that it was necessary, and thankfully owned that it was kind. The arrangements for her new establishment were soon completed, and the time came when Laura was to begin her life of seclusion. The day before her intended removal she completed her 20th year, and Mrs. Douglas would have assembled a little group of friends to celebrate the occasion, but Laura steadily opposed it. "Let not one who is suspected," said she, "assume the boldness of innocence. Yet, since the suspicion wrongs me, I will not wear the melancholy of guilt. Give the children a holiday for my sake, and I shall be as playful and as silly as the youngest of them." The holiday was granted, and Laura, amidst the joyful, noisy little company that soon assembled round her, forgot that she was an outcast. She was busily searching every corner for the hidden handkerchief, the little rogue who had concealed it in his shoe, laughing the while and clapping his hands in delight, when she started at the voice of a stranger in the lobby, who was announcing that he had a letter for Mrs. Douglas, which he could deliver to no person but herself, The next moment the stranger was shown into the room, and Laura, with amazement, beheld her American attendant. The amazement on his part was still greater. He started, he trembled, he at first shrunk from Laura, then eagerly advancing towards her. "Bless my soul, madam!" he exclaimed. "Are you alive? Then Mary's words are true, and the angels watch over you." It was some time before the man's astonishment would permit him to declare his errand. At last, when his curiosity had been partially satisfied, he was prevailed upon to enter his narrative. "You may remember, madam," said he, addressing himself to Laura, "it was the morning we expected my master, though I told Mary, for a make-believe, that he would not come till evening. That morning Mary took you out and left you, for which I was mortal angry with her, for my mind misgave me that some mischief would come of it. So she ran down to the place where she left you sitting, but you were not there. Then she looked all about, but she could not see you nowhere. She was afraid to go among the canes for fear of the rattlesnakes, so she ran home and told me. So I went with her, scolding her to be sure all the way. Well, we sought and sought, till at last, half in the water and half on the shore, we found your hat, and then, to be sure, none of us never doubted that you had drowned yourself." And Mary cried and wrung her hands like a distracted creature, saying that my master was a wicked wretch that had broken your heart, and often she wished that we could find you to give you Christian burial, for she said she was sure your ghost would never let her rest in her bed. But we had no drags, nor anything to take you up with out of the water. Well, we were just in the midst of all our troubles when my master came. "Well, Robert," says he, in his hearty way, "where is my angel?" I had not the heart to say a word, so with that Mary ran forward sobbing like a baby, and says she, just off-hand, "Miss Montraville is in a watery grave, and I am sure, sir, some heavy judgment will light on him that drove her to it." So my master stood for a moment thunderstruck, as it were, and then he flew upon us both like a tiger, and shook us till he scarce left breath in us, and swore that it was all a trick, and that he would make us produce you, or he would have our lives. So I tried to pacify him the best I could, but Mary answered him that it was all his own doing, and that he might seek you in the river where he could find your corpse. This put my master quite beside himself, and he catched her up and flung her from him just as if she had been a kitten, and then he flew down to the riverside, and I followed him and showed him where we had found your hat, and explained to him how it was not our fault, for we had both been very civil and given you no disturbance at all, which you know, madam, was true. So, close to the place where we found your hat, we saw the print of your little shoe in the bank, and when my master saw it, he grew quite distracted, crying out that he had murdered you, and that he would revenge you upon a wretch not fit to live, meaning himself, madam, and so he would have leaped into the river. But by this time one of the servants he brought with him came up, and we forced him back to the house. Then he grew more quiet, and called for Mary, and gave her his purse with all his money, and bid her tell everything about you, madam, how you had behaved, and what you had said. So she told him, crying all the while, for she repented from her heart that ever she consented to have any hand in the business. And sometimes he would start away and gnash his teeth and dash his head against the wall. and sometimes he would bid her go on, that he might run distracted at once and forget all. So she told him that you had written to one Mrs. Douglas in hopes that when you were dead he would take pity on you, repeating your very words, madam. Then he asked to see the letter, and he carried it into your room, and there we heard him groaning and speaking to himself and throwing himself against the walls, and we thought it best to let him come to himself a little and not disturb him. So by and by he called for pen and ink, and I carried them to him, thinking if he wanted to write it was a sign he was growing more calm. Then he continued writing for some time, though now and again we heard him restless as before. At last he opened the door and called me. "Robert," says he, quite calm and composed like, "if you deliver this package as directed, you will earn £300, but be sure to deliver it with your own hand." I was going to ask him something more about it, for I did not just know what he meant about the £300, but he pushed me out and shut himself into the room. Then I bethought myself that there was something strange like in his look, and that he was pale and somehow not like himself. So I went to the kitchen to consult with the rest what we had best do. So I had scarcely got there when I heard a pistol go off, and we all ran and burst open the door, and there we saw my master, madam, laid out upon Miss Montreville's bed, and the pistol still in his hand, though he was stone dead, madam, for I suppose the ball had gone right through his heart. Laura, dreadfully shocked and no longer able to listen to this horrible relation, hastened out of the room, leaving Mrs. Douglas to hear what yet remained to be told of the history of a man of pleasure. The servant proceeded to tell that he and his companions had conveyed their master's body to headquarters, had seen it buried with military honors, and then had sailed in the first ship for Britain. That remembering the charge to deliver the packet with his own hand, he had come down to Scotland on purpose to execute his trust, and hoped that Mrs. Douglas would fulfill his master's promise. He then delivered the packet, which Mrs. Douglas, opening in his presence, found to contain a bill for £300 in favour of Robert Lewson, not payable without her signature, the 2 letters which Laura had written during her exile, and the following lines, rendered almost illegible by the convulsive startings of the hand which traced them. "The angel whom I have murdered was an angel still. The destroyer came, but found her not. It was her last wish that you should know her innocence. None can attest it like me. She was purer than heaven's own light. She loved you. There is another, too, whom she protests that she loved to the last. But it was me alone whom she loved with passion. In the anguish of her soul, she called it idolatry. And the words of agony are true. But I, like a base fool, cast her love away for the heartless toyings of a wanton. And shall I, who might have been so blessed, live now to bear the gnawings of this viper, this hell never to be escaped? She has said that she must go to the grave laden with shame, that her name is degraded through me. Once more, then, I charge you, proclaim her innocence. Let no envious tongue presume to stain that name. Let it be accounted holy. I will save what she loved better than life, though I have persecuted her, driven her to death, forced her to hide in the cold waters all that was loveliest in woman. She says that she will meet you in heaven, and it must be true, for falsehood was a stranger to her lips. Then tell her that he who was her murderer was her avenger too. It is said that self-destruction is the last, worst crime. In others it may be so. In me it is but justice, for every law condemns the murderer to die. He who destroyed that angel should die 1,000 deaths. Justice shall be speedy. Villiers Hargrave. Mrs. Douglas had no sooner read the contents of her packet than she hastened to communicate them to Laura. The horror inspired by Hargrave's letter, and the dreadful destiny of the writer, did not render her insensible to the pleasure of being empowered to clear, beyond a doubt, the fame of her young friend. Laura was, however, for the present, in no state to share her joy. She could only weep, and, trembling, pray that she might be enabled to guard against the first beginnings of that self-indulgence whose end is destruction. Mrs. Douglas at last found means to rouse her by naming De Courcy, and reminding her of his right to immediate information of this happy change in her situation. Laura, as superior to coquetry as to any other species of despicable cruelty, instantly sat down to communicate the news to her lover. To her plain, unvarnished tale she added copies of the letters which attested her innocence, with Lucian's account of the names and addresses of those persons who had been employed to carry her from England. Evening was drawing on before Laura had finished her task, and, desirous to recruit her spirits before she joined the family circle, she stole abroad to breathe the reviving air of her native hills. She had crossed the little lawn and was opening the gate when, seeing a carriage drive quickly up, she drew back. The carriage stopped. She heard an exclamation of joy, and the next moment she was pressed to the heart of De Courcy. Laura first recovered utterance. "What happy chance," she cried, "has brought you here just at the moment when I am permitted to rejoice that you are come?" "Ah, Laura," said De Courcy, "could I know that you were alive and in Britain, yet make no effort to find you? I was convinced that Mrs. Douglas must know your retreat. I was sure that I could plead so that no human heart could resist my entreaties. And now I have found thee, I will never leave thee but with life." The little shrubbery walk which led round the lawn to the parsonage was not 1/4 of a mile in length, yet it was an hour before the lovers reached the house, and before Laura presented De Courcy to her friends, she had promised that in 1 week she would reward his tried affection, and had settled that after they had spent a few days in delightful solitude at Glenalbert, she would accompany him to Norwood. Laura has now been for some years a wife, and the same qualities which made her youth respectable endear her to the happy partner of her maturer life. She still finds daily exercise for her characteristic virtue, since even amidst the purest worldly bliss self-denial is necessary. But the tranquil current of domestic happiness affords no materials for narrative. The joys that spring from chastened affection, tempered desires, useful employment, and devout meditation must be felt. They cannot be described. End of chapter 34. Recording by Diane Castillo. End of Self-Control, a novel by Mary Brunton.